Good morning, everyone. We are just waiting for colleagues to actually join us. The numbers are going up gradually, so if you are wondering, really, we are just going to give another minute or so before we actually get started. Thank you very much. Okay, I see that numbers have actually stabilised, so I am actually going to start the event really. So, very good morning, everyone. My name is Abdul Razaq, and I'm the Director of Public Health at Blackburn with Darwen Council. And it's a pleasure really to actually be with you here this morning, and really a very warm welcome really to all delegates, to all speakers actually joining us, and all listeners really as this conference really of Food Active is being recorded. The theme this year is prioritising child healthy weight in an age of crises, and we're looking forward to a really exciting morning. You will have me for the first half, and then I'll hand over around 11 o'clock to Matthew Philpott, who will actually take you through the latter part of the conference. Really appreciate your time and attendance here today, and we hope that you actually have a very enjoyable and very informative experience this morning. Previous conferences have actually been hugely popular really, and it's great to see that you've been able to actually join us during the day and this morning. Something really in terms of just a bit of a background for those who are actually not very familiar with Food Active. The Food Active journey actually started approximately 10 years ago. I think it'll be next year when it will be formally 10 years. And it came about really as a result of Northwest Director of Public Health wanting to actually do something in terms of child obesity and in terms of advocacy and lobbying work, but also really to actually build a social momentum in relation to nutrition, food, and health. And clearly, in the early part of that journey, I certainly was working with our dear colleagues really who are central to the planning and delivery of the conference today. So it's a delight really to actually be with you again. We do actually have social media. And we do have a hashtag really this morning. So if you are in the social media frame of mind and you're a tweeter, so it's hashtag FoodActive 2022. And please do actually tweet during the conference really to actually promote some of the range of discussion. In terms of the program, the program clearly is full and packed really with some exciting speakers, as I said really, and clearly I'll be introducing colleagues in due course. If I can just remind speakers really that we are going to be pushed for time, and so basically I will give you a minute's kind of lead in towards closure. So please, if you can, keep to your allotted time. In terms of overall housekeeping, just a few points really. Basically, clearly, time and Q&As. We have left some time really for Q&As as part of the morning. Please do join the conversations on social media, but also in the actual chat facility as well. And clearly, without your further, without actually kind of extending this any further, really, basically, I wish you all a very pleasurable kind of experience this morning in terms of the actual content. So at this point, really, I think I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker really is Catherine Jenner, who's director at the Obesity Health Alliance. So welcome, Catherine. Really, if we can have you on camera, and I'm just going to hand over to Catherine, who's actually going to tell us really about let them eat 3 cakes for the price of 2. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can get share screen. Very good, and you can hear me? You'll tell me if otherwise. I'm pleased to give me my minute warning. Good morning, and thank you so much for having me. You've got me right. Yes. Thank you to Food Active for having me, and of course for the trailblazing work that you do as well. I am Catherine. I'm the new director of the Obesity Health Alliance, and our members represent all sectors of health, so BMA, British Heart Foundation, Cancer Research, Royal Colleges, NGOs, patient groups, and hopefully many people joining us here today. And we have a real focus on health, not just obesity, but improving health, so prevention, treatment, and support as well. So I've been asked to speak today about where we are with children's health, a bit about the policy context, which if you've been following the news, you'll be up to date on it as I am, but pre, during, post-COVID as well. A bit of the population or national policies to address obesity, some threats, concerns, and hopefully some opportunities. And I want to try and do this a bit through a history lesson of the volume price promotions restrictions, aka the bog-offs. So, that's right. Let them eat cake. The traditional translation of "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche, sorry for my French there, said to have been spoken in the 17th or 18th century by a great princess upon being told that the peasants had no bread. Brioche considered to be a luxury food and something that's actually coming back into fashion now. The quote is taken to reflect either the princess's very frivolous disregard for the starving peasants or for her poor understanding of their plight. It was particularly powerful because the staple food of the French peasantry and the working class was bread, taking up to 50% of their income. Well, today, in our modern times, Food Foundation research has shown that those on lower incomes have to spend about half of their incomes to achieve the government's recommended healthy diet. But of course, that's not what's actually happening, because shoppers are being encouraged to spend their hard-earned cash on less healthy food and drinks that they didn't even intend to buy by a mixture of very clever, well-tested marketing techniques, including bog-offs, leaving less money available for healthier food. So as a result, is good health to become the luxury of the wealthiest? And why have I brought up bog-offs, aka the multi-buy deals or the volume price restrictions, when it's already been sent to the slaughterhouse like the sacrificial lamb? Well, it's been delayed for a year rather than coming in October. Firstly, as you can probably tell, I'm still a bit sore about it. Secondly, although there is almost universal agreement that a broad suite of measures is required to improve health and that there's no one solution, many accepted the argument that it was the wrong time for this policy to come in. And I want to try and reflect and understand why, so we can be better prepared to fight for other policies we believe in when the time comes, and for October 2023, when hopefully this comes back. And thirdly, it's a matter of principle. Is buy 3 cakes for the price of 2 the best we can do for our kids? This was just a couple of screenshots yesterday, particularly of cakes or cake bars, as it turns out now, on special offer at supermarkets at the moment. And of course, there were millions of multi-buy offers, not just price reductions, but multi-buy offers as well on various cakes, biscuits, crisps, soft drinks, boxes of sweets and such like. We have a bit of a national obsession with promotions. Between a quarter and a third of all food is bought on promotion. And while these volume promotions, that means buying more rather than a price discounted, while they appear to make products cheaper, they also intend to encourage people to buy more. And as it's the higher fat, high salt, high sugar food items that tend to be promoted, people buy more unhealthily. I'll mention sugar because it is Sugar Awareness Week next week, so please look out for that. Kantar and Public Health England did an analysis ahead of the volume restrictions and estimated that about 9% of all take-home sugar was as an incremental consequence of volume promotions. That means that's extra sugar that we wouldn't have otherwise bought, with about 6% of that coming from those higher sugar categories that would have been included in this policy. In other words, we could have taken 6% saving in sugar volumes right out of our diets if we'd gone ahead with this policy. That equates to 7.5 grams of sugar per person per day, over 50 grams a week. And you can compare that with the likes of the currently considered most successful policy, the soft drinks levy, which has taken 30 grams per person. So the predicted impact was really huge. And why is this important? Childhood obesity rates were already unacceptably high before the pandemic and were rising at a rate of about 1% year on year, for the last 30 years. An average of 12 children in a class of 30 having overweight or obesity across all 4 nations. For the richest people in the country, obesity rates are fairly stable to where they were a decade ago, but they have skyrocketed amongst the poorest, who are twice as likely to have overweight. So if you've got children in a class at the moment and there's maybe 1 or 2 larger kids in their class, know that somewhere else in the country, that's not just the It's not just common, but it is the norm. And those kids are 5 times more likely to have excess weight as an adult, leading to life-limiting physical and mental health conditions, quite expensive conditions like type 2 diabetes. World Diabetes Day on Monday found last week that the numbers of people under 40 with diabetes have jumped 23% in the last 5 years. So this is nothing new. It's clear that the pandemic exacerbated what was already a bad situation, and the precise causes will still need to be analysed. But we do know that sales of unhealthy food products increased during this time, and that manufacturers wasted no time pouncing on people's understandable desire for comfort and convenience foods during lockdown, particularly delivery apps. So you can see at the end, there's a little dip down, and it's welcome to see rates come slightly down from their record high of last year, but they're still far above pandemic levels. So it is of the utmost importance that the UK government is committed to reducing the prevalence of obesity and improving child health, and that obesity policy is guided by evidence, not ideology. So we're still desperately trying to find out whether our new Prime Minister will restate the commitment to halving childhood obesity by 2030. This research from IPPR shows that the cost associated with no further action on child health of the current cohort of children will cost billions over the course of their lifetime. So action is a necessity, an economic necessity. And if we can hit the target of halving childhood obesity by 2030, looks at watch to see where we are now, bit of a not very long to go, but we could save an extra 37 billion to the NHS and 202 billion to wider society. So a target worth bearing in mind. When we looked at the causes of obesity, this is sort of an attempted summary of the Foresight report by the OHA. You can see, and we all know, there are many, many, many causes. And for that reason, many, many, many solutions are needed. But there is convincing evidence that the right strategy, one that takes a systems-wide approach across everywhere that we live, learn, work and play, will enable everyone to move towards enjoying improved well-being and a healthy weight, regardless of their age, ethnicity and background. But food in particular is a significant and modifiable risk factor. You've probably seen this before from the Lancet. This excellent graphic is from National Food Strategy, which shows dietary related ill health related to all the pink causes of death there. They're called avoidable causes of death, but I would say not avoidable in the current food environment within which we live. But why would what we eat have such a disproportional impact on those on lower incomes? Food is food, right? Well, one of the reasons is that healthy food does tend to be more expensive. Again, this is from the National Food Strategy, a study by Griffin, I think, which I love. And if you look at what's on the cheaper end of the scale, which is this side to me, so you can see we've got a scale going from most healthy foods as defined by the nutrient profile model to the least healthy. It may be opposite to the way I'm looking on the screen. And you can see that towards the scale, as it moves towards the most healthy products, there tends to be an increased price per calorie. If you look at the cheaper end of the scale, chocolate, cookies, crisps, cost per calorie, they're pretty cheap. These are products that don't need to be on special offer. The foods that we plan for, that make up our meals, that are healthier snacks, fruit, vegetables, and cost more, they're the ones that should be on special offer. Chocolate, cookies, and crisps are all available and they're all affordable. They don't need to be on offer. The Food Foundation's Anna Taylor, I think, is coming along later today, so I'm sure we'll talk more about food insecurity. So I won't say much other than the current data reveals that food prices increases are really negatively impacting the quality of diets, which were already very poor, with food insecure households buying fewer veg, fruit, fewer high-value protein items such as meat and fish. And to many, it may seem counterintuitive even that not having an abundant food supply can cause obesity, but infrequent, low-quality meals can increase a person's weight. Childhood obesity is hidden hunger. So when we're talking about food environment, it can't be just quantity versus quality. It has to be both. Hopefully you've seen this as well. Paper by Thayers and White identifying 14 government-led strategies over the 30 years in England with 700 proposed policies. Now, what I found particularly interesting about this was that only 19% of the policies proposed were structural, meaning that they made the fewest demands on an individual's motivation or their ability to engage with information and advice, and were therefore likely to be effective in reducing inequalities. So that may go some way to explain why efforts to reduce health inequalities have widely failed. That, and the fact that most of these policies were only proposed, not implemented. So why are we proposing policies that won't tackle inequalities? And what does actually work? The soft drinks industry levy, which was it was announced in 2016 and technically implemented in 2018, but that 2 years seemed to be really key in driving forward change, have a key role to play. That levy made the products themselves healthier. It led to sugar consumption falling by 30 grams per week, not affecting sales. But it also raised £1 billion for children to have greater access to healthier food through school breakfast clubs, all paid for by the soft drinks companies. Importantly, it also reduced sugar across all socio-economic groups, as you can see there from that slide. So you would think that it would make sense that any future proposed national policies would build on what works. So let's roll forwards now to 2020. Sadly, as a result of the death rate involving COVID being twice as high for people living with obesity, the then Prime Minister, if you all remember, decided it was time to take action, particularly in England anyway, and announced a raft of policies, some of which did not have an emphasis on individual behaviour. Policies to restrict place and price promotions of unhealthy food and drinks, including a ban on online advertising before 9 p.m. on TV of some products high in salt, fat or sugar. Some that did have more of an emphasis on individual behaviour, such as calorie labelling on menus, and some that completely relied on individual behaviour and took up most of the budget, providing information and services. So the Better Health campaign based on a NHS 12-week weight loss app plan. Let's have a look at how that panned out. So we had a raft of consultations launched. Calorie labelling was pretty much ready to go because it had already been consulted on. So we had consultations on the place and price promotions and the online and TV restrictions. We had the Better Health campaign launched, public health campaign, and we had money that was promised for weight support services, which was later withdrawn, and a raft of conflicting health messages as well, not least the Eat Out, Help Out scheme. Poor diets, exacerbated by the lockdown and a lack of timely action from the government, led to this increase in excess weight and further widened existing inequalities. And it's a shame because these policies generally have really wide public support. They want to make it easier to make healthier choices. Healthier food, you will notice if you have a look at some of these quotes, if you have a look, healthier food in most people's mind does still seem to equal salad and lettuce, without people perhaps appreciating that healthier food in a policy context is basically anything that isn't the worst snacks and drinks. Plus, I'm sure I heard someone argue that having lettuce on multi-buy deal wouldn't work because it's short shelf life. But we now know that lettuce can last longer than Prime Minister. So these policies did finally receive royal assent in April of last year, pretty much 2 years on. And then there was a very swift U-turn in May. First with Boris Johnson announcing a delay to the volume price restrictions and the advertising delay. And then in September, Liz Truss doubling down and putting the whole policy, the whole strategy, under threat, not just of delay, but of repeal. Erroneously claiming that the reason was cost of living, but despite what Liz Truss and probably Institute of Economic Affairs and others claim, as I've shown, 3 for 2 cake bars are not part of the solution to the cost of living, or as we're calling it, the poverty and inequalities crisis. In the long term, it will actually cost the poorest in our society the most in their future health, their finances, and their opportunities. We were not the only ones up in arms. I just draw attention to this great article, which if you haven't read, please do try and hunt it out. That's behind paywall. An incredible, powerful piece from Dr. Rachel Class, who said she doesn't want to see more people dying of cancer, stroke disease, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. She said, obesity will never be a simple matter of personal responsibility when the food industry spends millions trying to override our willpower and in lobbying those with political power. And my favourite line, as though freedom fundamentally is about our inalienable rights to drink syrupy iron brew. Joining in the outrage were previous health ministers, so coordinated by Lord Bethell and the Royal College of Physicians, asking the government to stand firm on obesity measures. Signed by this letter, here's a list of some of the signatories there. You might recognise some of the names, including Jeremy Hunt and Steve Bryan. We suspect that Kwasi never got round to opening his mail for this, so I'm hoping that Jeremy Hunt found a nice letter addressed with his signature on it when he arrived in post. But they understand the level of change that's needed, that this level of change doesn't happen without government intervention. And if you want a healthy economy, you have to have a healthy population. It's as simple as that. So these multi-buy promotions, they make economic sense. They have health community support. They have ex-health minister support. A recent survey Cancer showed cancer research showed that 60% of people still supported the restrictions coming in originally as planned. So why were they not implemented? And of course, we'll never quite know what's behind it, but 3 things I'd like to draw attention: lobbying, the cost of living argument, and the ideology. This recent paper came out from the Food Research Collaboration, which found some evidence of lobbying, not so much to the Department of Health, but perhaps to other departments, such as the Department of Media. However, they noted that delays or procrastinations in implementation may be, in fact, the objective of lobby efforts, rather than having them cancelled. Just having them delayed is what they want to happen. And we see intense lobbying going on, particularly by the food trade bodies right now, on advertising and reformulation. And I can tell you categorically, it is not due to the cost of living. The strong role played by the private sector needs to be recognised and addressed, but not by me, not here today. The cost of living argument. So the government cited concerns about the impact of the multi-buy restrictions on the cost of living. But as the Lords Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee found afterward, this was directly contrary to the evidence in the government's own impact assessment for the policy. And the government has not since been able to bring forward any evidence to justify this claim. And hopefully, as I've shown you, it's an erroneous argument anyway. The ideological aspect, well, we know the nanny state argument lives and breathes on, and that the Libertarians have had a huge influence on this government, not just Liz Truss, but on the last 3 prime ministers. And we sincerely hope that now the Trussonomics has been shown not to work, we can clearly show that the IEA or Truss's health policy doesn't work as well. The top of mind reactionary viewpoint from members of the public and politicians alike is that the nanny state is very unpopular, and whatever your political persuasion. However, when it comes to individual policies, as we've seen, there's really high support for making it easier to make healthy choices, especially when it comes to children and child health. And in fact, in our research in our 10-year healthy weight strategy, Turning the Tide, concerns about the government interfering or mentions about the nanny state were not even raised during any of our interviews, with this libertarian narrative seen in the media just not being reflected in interviewees' responses. Unpopular decisions by brave politicians and leaders change the narrative and over time change minds. There is another problem as well, that of stigma. Framing problems as being solved by personal behaviour change takes the public mind away from the real structural change that is needed. And these views are still fairly pervasive, and not enough has been done to tackle them. But we know that it is not a case of individual responsibility. A lack of action is legitimised by the stigma, but obesity is not a choice. It is not a behaviour that can be changed. It is not solely the responsibility of an individual. And shame and stigma cause damage and lead neither to weight loss nor to health. I often think that this is an area where we collectively are not bold enough in restating our values. Improving health is about tackling fundamental inequalities in our society. Every child has the right to have what they need to be healthy and thrive, and we cannot allow good health to become a luxury of the very wealthiest. So where are we today? Now, we have a new premiership, a new chancellor. We're awaiting that lovely renewed commitment to improving health. In England, the calorie labelling and menus came in, so we'll wait to see some reviews of that. We still have the soft drinks industry levy, mostly because the government needed the money. The locations restrictions came into force in October, and many are seeing that happen now. I've been talking to Food Active about what that might look like. And the advertising is still planned for January, but we know that's going to be delayed for the following year. But this does give us a bit of time to reflect and think about what happens next. We can and must do more to protect people from a food system that makes it harder than it should be to be healthy. We need to prioritise child health, ensuring children have got enough good food to make it easier for people to afford the food they need. We need to build on what works. So we've got loads of policies in the pipeline that are good and that should work. We need to try and implementing them. So smart, effective ideas like the soft drinks industry levy to make healthy options more accessible and affordable. And of course, the advertising restrictions as well. And hopefully somewhere down the line, multi-buys as well. We also know that national government has got such a crucial role in supporting local communities and creating healthier environments. Across the country, local leaders are eager to make communities healthier, but often lack the powers, whether that be planning laws, advertising regulations, budgets and resources to do so. So we're going to be looking to you all to help guide our thinking there. and I share a quote from Dame Una Bryan, it's important that policy ownership and the drive for change for improving healthy weight continues to be located within health departments. However, this must be accompanied with levers to strengthen their individual and collective authority to lead and coordinate implementation, particularly with local authorities and local communities. I hope you'll get some agreement from that around the room. So finally, and back to bog-offs, well, there's been a bit of good news. So this was just some screen grabs today. You can have a little look at some of the things that have been included on multi-buy offers. There has been a marked decline in multi-buy offers on healthy foods. And it's great to see healthy foods that people actually plan to put in their shopping baskets more in the spotlight. Some supermarkets have pledged not to run multi-buy restrictions at all, not to run multi-buy offers at all, and have moved to everyday low prices because they understand that they do not represent good value for their customers. But of course, without legislation and with only self-regulation, there are always going to be loopholes. There's always going to be rowing back, and there's always going to be exemptions. Christmas, for instance, coming up. Wait to see how many special offers you're going to see in Christmas, and probably some flouting of the locations restrictions as well. There's not a level playing field that we so vitally need to improve everybody's health, including those on lower incomes. So not all customers are benefiting equally. One day we will be out of these various crises, and if we have had a successful health improvement strategy, it will help reduce the pressure on the NHS and social care, increase productivity, and bring long, happy lives. So let them eat cake. Well, you can still buy and eat cake if you want to. It's still there. And of course, you can make your own at home as well. But I think we need to change the story a bit. So let them eat food and drinks with a healthier nutrition profile. That's me.
Thank you so much, really, Catherine, really for guiding us through it. Absolutely fantastic kind of opening session there, really, and great presentation and some great content in there as well. So and thank you very much for actually sticking to time as well, really, within time, really. So that gives me some time to actually kind of
Abdul, normally I'm put at the end of days because I'll always make up the time by talking super quickly. Thank you.
No, that's absolutely amazing. I hope you can stay for the rest of the morning. And some really interesting points there, really, around government policy, and around, the social, moral, and economic kind of counter narrative that we need to kind of enforce, really, as well, really. So I think that's very, very powerful. And thank you for OHA and everything in terms of your leadership for everything that you do with us around this agenda. So without basically, I think we'll move on, really, if we may, really, to our next speaker. I'm just going to introduce Dr. Oliver Mitten, who's Honorary Consultant in Public Health Medicine at the University College London and Consultant in Public Health at Milton Keynes. And Oliver's going to be speaking to us around COVID-19 and the impact on child healthy weight. Ollie, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Just to check you can hear me okay and see my screen.
Perfectly. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Oh dear. Can we move forward? Yeah. So today I'm going to start by talking about the impact of a pandemic on healthy weight. I'm really going to focus my attention on overweight and obesity because that's where we've seen the issue. I haven't noticed any significant signal about around underweight. I'm going to talk about why we've seen the changes that have happened, and then talk about what may happen next, and then briefly at the end touch on the implications for children's health. So in terms of looking at obesity and overweight, I'm going to focus very much on data from the National Child Measurement Programme. Many of you may be familiar with this programme. Briefly, it measures the height and weight of children in primary school in their first and last years, so reception and year 6. It's undertaken by local teams. They follow very clear standardised national protocols, and all of the data analysis is undertaken centrally, including significant checks around data quality. So it's a great data set. Some considerations when we're looking at this. So I'm going to focus my attention very much on the headline overall patterns, but I will dip in and look at some of the subgroup effects where I think there's things of note. Secondly, I think in our head, we will naturally be drawn to look at what's happened during the pandemic, but we also need to keep one eye on what the underlying trends are. So is childhood obesity staying flat, or is it actually on an upwards trajectory before the pandemic? And then thirdly, we should also remember that COVID affected the National Child Measurement Programme. So the programme was in part suspended for 2 years during the pandemic, part due to school closures and in part due to staff being redeployed to other activities. So starting with reception children, so just to orientate you all, we've got time on the bottom axis, and then the vertical axis, we've got percentage of children. The dark blue line at the bottom is percentage of children living with obesity, with severe obesity, middle line living with obesity, and the light blue line at the top is both overweight and obesity combined. So I think there's three things we should take from this graph. So first, looking at that underlying trend, it's remarkably flat from the period of 2006 through to pre-pandemic 2019-20. Very little, a bit of noise, but overall remarkably flat. Secondly, I think as we've all heard, things got noticeably worse during the pandemic. Thirdly, and encouragingly, it looks for this age group as if things have fully recovered, or at least largely recovered, and we're back to where we were pre-pandemic. There's maybe a bit of a question mark about children with severe obesity. That's 2.9% post-pandemic versus 2.5% pre-pandemic. Maybe a bit of noise, maybe something significant going on there. Okay, moving on and looking at year 6 children. So a similar chart, but note that the underlying level of obesity and overweight is higher. So the vertical axis has a different scale. So again, pre-pandemic, not a flat trend, just a very slight upwards trend, but noticeable, about a 1 percentage point increase every 5 years over the last 10 years. And again, we see a very similar effect. During the pandemic, things got noticeably worse. And then thirdly, after the pandemic, we've certainly seen a recovery, but things are not back to where they were before the pandemic. Even after we allow for that gradual upwards trend, things are in a worse position than they were pre-pandemic. So quite a difference in what we're seeing here between reception and year 6 children. Okay, so let's dig down and look at some socio-demographic groups. So I've looked at data in terms of sex, ethnicity, regional differences and deprivation. And overall, I don't see any obvious or strong differences between sex or ethnic groups or regions arising due to the pandemic, i.e. both boys and girls went up, but they've gone up by a similar amount and they've now come down by a similar amount. However, there are some striking differences by deprivation, and I think we should just explore those in a bit more depth. So starting again with reception children, so similar graph to the ones we were looking at before, but note here that the time period is slightly different, so it starts in 2013-14. The dashed line at the bottom here represents children living in the least deprived areas, 10%, and the solid line at the top represents children living in the most deprived areas, again 10% of children. So looking at that underlying trend, we can see there's a slight increase or widening of that gap over time, but it's pretty slight. And again, during the pandemic, that gap got much worse. It's recovered somewhat during the pandemic, but it is actually noticeably worse than it was pre-pandemic. So quite interesting for reception children. Overall levels of obesity back to normal, but we are left with a wider gap between the most and least deprived, or children living in the most and least deprived areas. Moving on, looking at year 6 children. So again, similar graph, higher baseline levels, much more pronounced widening of that gap over time before pandemic, widening of that gap during the pandemic, and a partial correction again after the pandemic. So again, we're left with this picture of the gap, the deprivation gap, health inequalities have widened during that pandemic, and that widening has persisted. So let's just summarize before we think about what's going on here or why it's happened. Let's just summarize where we're up to. So prevalence of obesity and overweight increased during the pandemic for both reception and year 6 children. Those increases have largely reversed for reception, but they partially persist for children in year 6. The deprivation gap has grown during the pandemic, and that's happened for both reception and year 6 children. So why have we seen these changes? So I think we all have our own experience of the pandemic, and it's probably impacted on our own individual health behaviours. We all have our own ideas as to how these things may have changed at a broader societal level and what the impacts may have been. What I'm going to try and do is support some of those ideas and hypotheses as best I can with some data. I think when looking at this data, we should also bear a couple of things in mind. Firstly, there will be variation in how people respond. So we tend to describe average effects. On average, where does the average move? Does it move in one direction or another? There is some suggestion in the pandemic that there's actually been quite a lot of movement in terms of some people getting better and some people getting worse, and it's sort of a change in the distribution as well. And we sometimes overlook that when we look at the averages. And then the other factor we should bear in mind is the change that's happened during the pandemic hasn't been fixed. I would suggest it would have been more pronounced during the first stages of the pandemic, when the measures were more stringent, for example, and may not have been so pronounced in the latter stages of the pandemic. So let's start with physical activity. So we might expect school closures, cancellation of organised sport and recreational activities, stay-at-home advice would all have resulted in reductions in physical activity. There was an important mitigation measure in place, which was a very strong direction and permission for people to leave the house once a day to be physically active. But overall, we might still expect a reduction in physical activity. And so actually looking at the literature, there's a really strong and consistent picture that both from the UK and internationally, that children experience consistent reductions in physical activity. And I'll just share with you one study. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis of physical activity levels of children during the pandemic. And what I really wanted to emphasize is this text in yellow that shows that some of those reductions have actually been really quite large. A 17-minute reduction in moderate to vigorous physical activity per day is huge. If we had interventions that could encourage children to do that, we would be in a very, very good space. So those are really quite profound changes. Okay, let's move on and think about diet. So we might, for example, see if children aren't in school eating school meals, that might have a negative impact on quality of food they eat, school meals being regulated at least to some extent in terms of their healthiness and quality. Some anecdotal reports about more snacking at home, and we would probably expect there to be more preparation or cooking of food at home, which may be negative for quality of food that people are eating, maybe positive. And we might expect there to be more consumption of takeaway food at home. Now, what data shows here is a bit more tricky, certainly tricky to interpret. I've not found any studies that have described the changes in children's eating habits during the pandemic compared to the pre-pandemic period. Where I have found evidence of findings that seem a bit more nuanced and mixed sort of findings. So, for example, and these are UK studies here of adults, not children, adults. There's one study conducted by a team in Liverpool that was done during the pandemic and asked people to comment on how their habits had changed in the first wave compared to pre-pandemic. And adults reported more snacking, actually a large increase in snacking. But they also reported they were just as likely to eat a healthy meal as they were during the pandemic as they were before the pandemic. A second UK study looking at using the Millennium Cohort Study, that's people who were born at the turn of the millennium, so they would have been 19 to 21 during the pandemic, so young adults. They actually reported eating more fruit and vegetables during the pandemic. So some mixed findings around diet, but as I say, I don't think we have great data. Diet is harder and more complicated to assess and measure, as there are many different dimensions to it. So I'm not saying diet isn't important, but I'm just saying the data isn't there to give us a clear picture as to what's happened. Finally, sleep. I don't think we talk about sleep enough. I think we should talk about it more. It's really important for physical activity, linked to healthy eating as well. It's also linked to obesity and cardiometabolic disease and other health outcomes, and of course, mental health. Now, we might expect pandemic, more anxiety and worry, people not sleeping as well, more time at home, less need to travel in the morning to commute to work or travel to school, possibly increased and better duration of sleep. Data from Millennium Cohort studying that group of young adults actually confirms that the latter, or shows some evidence of the latter, people reporting better and longer duration of sleep, which we'd expect to be protective of obesity. So some really good, strong evidence around reductions in physical activity. I'm sure there's been some significant changes, but harder to tease out just what they've been, particularly in children in the UK, and probably also some changes happening around sleep, which may actually have been more on the protective side. So let's just think now about what happens next. So I think there's two possible scenarios. There's a good scenario, if you like, and that's perhaps what we're seeing with the reception year, where things return broadly to the baseline levels we saw before the pandemic. And then there's a bad scenario where some of the negative impact, either in terms of behaviours or excess weight, it kind of sticks around and persists. And whether that happens or not, I suggest is going to depend on three factors. So first, it will depend on what happens to the behaviours, physical activity, diet and sleep. If those behaviours return to baseline, then probably something after a sort of 12 to 18 month period, we'd expect the weight status to return to baseline too. Probably. I think the caveat to that, I think we can, it perhaps looks as if children are heading in that way. The children are back in school and school is back normal as it was before. Probably some more persistent differences for adults in terms of changes in working patterns, and maybe also some changes in social patterns for adults too. The second factor to consider is what happens. So there is this idea that childhood obesity is really important to tackle because there's an early window to intervene, even in the first 5 or 10 years of life. And if we get children on the right trajectory or a different trajectory, then they'll stay on that trajectory throughout life. And this relates to the set point theory of obesity, that if we gain weight, our body tends to protect and hold that new weight status. It's not just hard to get back to our old weight, but actually once we get to that old weight, we have to be more physically active or eat a different diet, fewer calories than we otherwise would have done when we were first at that lower weight. So it is possible that some of these differences we are seeing between reception and year 6 may be due to older children having their set point reset at a higher level, and it's just not so easy for them to get their weight back down for physiological and biological reasons. Now, this is very speculative, and I think it's far too early to say with any degree of confidence as to whether that's what's going on, but it does seem to me quite noticeable, the difference between reception and year 6, and I think that's something we need to keep a very close eye on. And then the third thing is the austerity and cost of living crisis. What's that going to mean for the options that people can put on their plate to eat and their opportunities to engage in physical activity? How will schools respond? Schools under significant financial pressure, will they pull back on sport and extracurricular activities, which are important both in terms of physical health, but also really important for children's mental well-being too. Should also say that the year 6 data and looking at that in repeat years is only going to be part of our understanding as to what's happening. And what we really need to understand is the present year 6 children and last year's year 6 children really need to see how their weight status tracks as they go through adolescence and into adult life. Okay, so let's just finish by touching on implications for children's health. Broadly, unfortunately, these are going to be negative. I think there's a more positive scenario, which is around, firstly, things largely return to where they were in terms of children's weight status, and also an assumption that most of the impact of obesity isn't born during childhood, but it's actually born during adult life, or at least it's only children who are more towards the severe end of the spectrum who will actually experience complications of obesity during childhood. More pessimistic scenario, and I put this slide up just to emphasize there is actually, and I think we often underestimate this, a significant burden in childhood as a result of childhood obesity. Childhood obesity isn't just about the health of those children in adult life, it's also about their health during childhood too. And if we're seeing more of those children at that severe end, and we saw a bit of a nudge for that around reception children, and as well as seeing it for the year 6 children, that's the territory when these kind of complications may be more likely. And then, of course, the second factor is, have we actually, unfortunately, put some older children onto a different trajectory, so they will actually hold that excess weight throughout their teenage periods and possibly into adult life. So again, I feel it's too early to make any strong predictions about what the impacts are going to be on children's health, but we're in the territory of those being negative. Just one other thing I wanted to remind us all of, I'm just conscious how much the debate has focused on what has happened during the pandemic and how that's been negative for children's health. I don't want this to come across in the wrong way, but I do think we need to remember that the really profound and big changes have happened before we started doing the National Child Measurement Programme. So if we went back to between 1990 and 2006, there was a 7 or 8-fold increase in the numbers of children with severe obesity. There was a 3-fold increase in the numbers of children with obesity, a 2-fold increase in the number living with overweight and obesity. So irrespective of whether things pan out well in the next few years or not, we still have a very, very significant problem that needs to be addressed with excess weight in childhood. I'm going to finish with my summary slide. I won't talk through that, but I'm happy to take any questions if there's time.
Thank you so much, really. Thanks for guiding us through there, Ollie, really. I think, are there any particular questions, really, so from the actual Q&As? Just going to see whether there's anything really that's immediately coming up. I can't see anything directly actually within. There's some comments really in relation to a very good presentation, but I think if we take those further down really in terms of an overall Q&A session, or Oliver, really, if that's okay, we probably do need to actually move on. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much really for guiding us through there, and some really interesting points there really in terms of the research and in terms of the actual data and insights really. So we look forward to clearly basically having a further discussion in relation to that in due course, if that's okay. I'm now going to bring up our next speaker, if that's okay. So our next speaker, colleagues, really is Professor Martin Carahan, who's Emeritus Professor of Food and Health Policy at City University of London. And Martin is going to be talking to us this morning about food politics and policies, ideals and think tanks. So Martin, a very warm welcome. If you can bring yourself on screen.
Sorry, Abdul, Martin's not able to join us today, so he sent in his pre-recorded presentation, which I've got up on screen here. Okay,
that's absolutely fine. So clearly, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for that, Beth. Really, so we're going to play Martin's presentation. Thank you, Beth.
Hi, morning everybody. I'm Martin Carahan. I'm Professor Emeritus of Food and Health Policy at the Centre for Food Policy in City University of London. I'm sorry I can't be there this morning. I have a previous appointment and I'm doing something rather dangerous. I'm recording this a week in advance. Given the current climate, things change so quickly that maybe some of what I say might be out of date in a week's time. Some of it hopefully, some of it not so hopefully. But let's see. Okay, title of my talk is Food Politics and Policies, Ideals and Think Tanks. I'm going to give you some background on food, and then I'm going to move on to an argument that I think the current debates are not around evidence. They're actually around ideology. And we're faced with issues around ideology and a government which believes certain things about food and food poverty and food insecurity. So it's sort of split into two. But some background. Here's a report from the Food Standards Agency in September, and they reported 40% of participants were worried about being able to afford food in the next month. 30% reported they'd skip the meal or cut down the size of the meals because they didn't have enough money to buy food. 32% reported they'd eaten food past its sell-by date. Now, the point here is that that may have been perfectly said, but they had to. They felt they had to. It's not a choice. 18% of participants turned off a fridge or freezer containing food at least once in the past month to save energy bills, and cut energy and save money. Now, again, the point is the reason the Food Standards Agency is is because of food hygiene issues and food poisoning. Now, I think this is an underestimate. This is a measure of food insecurity, which is based on a USDA module of a series of questions. If you look at debt, 1 in 7 people in the UK are in debt, 7.1 million, more than financially excluded. And this is at a time when grocery bills this week are forecast to rise by £12 per week. And I'll show you something for food insecure people. This is probably more. This is an average food basket increase. And food banks, at a time when food banks are seeking more than money, and donations, because their donations have gone down, demand has gone up, and they're looking for money in order to buy food because they're not getting enough donations. So the poverty premium, I mean, if you look at what's happened in the last year, average food inflation is running at about 12.1%, but some goods have gone up more than others. And so people on low incomes are paying more for some basic necessities such as pasta. So that's gone up, pasta's gone up 60%, bread has gone up 37%. And you can see other things. The average food inflation, as I said, is running around 12.1% at the moment. But some basic goods of which low income groups rely on more have gone up disproportionately more. So they're paying a poverty premium. Pasta, for all sorts of reasons, it stores well, you can add something to it, it keeps till the end of the month, etc., etc. And that's the reason why. I just pulled out the data for Liverpool in terms of being financially excluded. It says 45,846 people are financially excluded in Liverpool. That is higher than the official figures on food insecurity. What happened in COVID lockdown here was the credit card companies, the reduction in debt was because the credit card companies stopped credit cards to 2 million low-income consumers. What we're now seeing is an increase in credit card indebtedness as people use credit cards to manage their financial situation through the month. And this is really worrying. There's also what's not accounted for in here is the unofficial loans, the buy now, pay later initiatives. There are a lot of apps where you can buy now, pay later, but the danger is people go into debt because of that. But here, you know, credit cards and loans were stopped, so people's indebtedness technically went down. The National Food Strategy, I mean, I could also say Michael Gove's education said that families are unable to manage their finances and they've only got themselves to blame. But Henry Dimbleby, in response to questions about the right to food, says twice of the National Food Strategy and the plan, which as we now know, the government have largely kicked into touch anyway, he had not included it because it had become politically polarizing. If you want to look that up, the evidence is there when he give evidence to a parliamentary committee, and the timeline is there where he says he had not included it because it had become politically polarizing. My argument about this is that it's politically polarizing because we've got a government and who believe that food poverty and poverty is self-inflicted. It's not necessarily one of structural inequalities. And we're constantly having to have this battle. For low-income groups, they're 1 income or paycheck away from destitution before COVID. That is now equally true, given what's happening with the war in Ukraine, the rising inflation, rising fuel bills, etc., etc. People on low incomes have used up their savings. They used them up in the first stages of COVID. That is why we're now seeing the previous thing I referred to about their use of credit cards. People use credit cards to tide themselves over from one financial time in the month to another. Family community networks are likely to be equally suffering, so there's less support there. You might, pre-COVID, have gone to your family or community for support. They're probably in the same situation. Overall, savings have increased among middle and high income groups. The irony is there's never been so much savings, but low income groups have no savings. They are relying on debt. So loans of up to 49% of interest, we're having what we call financial toxicity. And the implications of this for food is what my colleague Liz Dalla used to call the elastic item in the budget. You can compromise on food, but you can't compromise on other things in the budget, such as travel costs, etc., etc. We're now seeing, as I said, debt re-rise among low-income groups. Sorry, then when I was going back, go back. Okay, and this is spread right across the community. This is from the Baker and Allied Workers Union, saying 40% of their members had not eaten enough. 1 in 5 said they'd lived in a household which had run out of food, and 35% ate less to ensure others had food to eat. Now, these are people who are in contact with food. This is not unusual. Across the food chain and the food sector, we are seeing people who work in the food industry with food subject to food insecurity. The point to make is that obesity and food poverty or food insecurity are linked. They're not separate issues, yet we have separate budgets for them. They coexist in the same groups. They may be at different times of the month, people overindulge, and other times of the month they go hungry. The whole population is clearly getting heavier, but the predominance of obesity is in low-income groups who go hungry. And the rest, children adversely affected by poor nutrition. Despite this common link, we have different budgets in terms of prevention and treatment. We don't look at the root cause, which is inequality. And the consequences of obesity and food poverty is that social life is impacted. And at this moment, families are making tough decisions about food, about household management, whether to eat, what to eat, whether to cook or heat the house. And food poverty is hidden. I mean, it's a stigma. We don't talk about food poverty. Okay, so this is what I call the war of ideas. Back in, I can't even remember when we wrote that. Myself and Ivan Perry wrote an editorial in 2017 in the BMJ. And we said at the time over here, the core issue is not about the effectiveness of taxes on unhealthy foods, but what about Catherine Smith calls the war of ideas. Industry arguments, often and government arguments often fall back on ideas of personal freedom. So, they criticize the nanny state, they criticize people in public health for enforcing decisions on people. In addition to the evidence from authoritative studies, and of course we do need those, we need a clear, simple and compelling narrative opposing all these misleading arguments. That hasn't disappeared even with the change of Prime Minister. This is still a government that believes that the nanny state is not necessarily good and we shouldn't be telling people what to do. So that's a front cover of Catherine's book, which is really worth reading. Okay, so here's an example. This may be out of date by the time of next week, but Caroline Johnson, a consultant pediatrician who's appointed as a health minister. She's voted against Marcus Rashford's attempt to improve access to free school meals, a policy endorsed by her own group, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. We currently have Theresa Coffey's move from health to DEFRA, but DEFRA controls the food agenda. The food strategy, the plan, the national food, it's a DEFRA agenda. So we still have the problem of someone who has been fairly vocal about her dislike of the nanny state, about telling people what to do, moved to DEFRA in charge of food and food supplies. So we're not out of the woods by any means yet. I've copied this from New Statesman a couple of weeks ago, is making the point that policies being made by these think tanks, the Adam Smith Institute, the Institute for Economic Affairs, the Taxpayers Alliance, the Centre for Policy Studies. Now, with the demise of Liz Truss, there's a feeling that maybe these are less powerful, but the ideas they expound about personal choice, low taxation, etc., are part of the prevailing agenda, which is overlapping with our health agendas. And they're all located within this street here in London. Some of their documents about food poverty, for example, are really, really worrying when you read them. This is a middle of the centre Social Market Foundation produced this actually really good report on measuring and mitigating child hunger in the UK, but it was funded by Deliveroo, a company who doesn't pay their workers a living wage. So we have these tensions. We got all these reports appearing with these tensions, and the very people that are sponsoring them are not actually paying living and minimum wages. I go back to Michael Marmot, and what Michael said was, a society is flourishing, health tends to flourish. A society has large social and economic inequalities. There are large inequalities in health. The health of the population is not just a matter of how well the health service is funded and functions, important as that is. Health is closely linked to conditions which people are born, grow, live, work and age, and inequities in power, money and resources, including, I would say, access to food, the social determinants of health. And one of the problems here is that it's really difficult to talk about food and food choice. Because people do have choice. I mean, people have the choice not to eat, but there are many things in public health we can do. And food is a measure of social inequality. If you'd asked me 6 months ago, and asked me where were the successes during post-COVID, I wouldn't have thought I'd be saying the US. But the US have actually reduced their food insecure among children. It's a relative success story. It's not a complete success story, but you know, they've, like us, they've gone through an economic crisis. And I'll flick to the next slide, which shows the figures. Food insecurity in households with children has dropped. The level of food insecurity has fallen. I mean, this is extraordinary. And the reasons for it are not because of provision of food through food banks or the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Action Program, or the WIC program, which is the Women, Women and Children, but that during COVID and post-COVID, they made 3 cash benefits available to families with children. Giving more money to people has reduced food insecurity among families and households with children. So it's not about giving people food through things like a food bank, it's giving people more money. We've known this for years in terms of the developing world. Give money to households and their food security increases. We now have at least an emerging data set saying, actually, if you want to improve food insecurity, give people money in their households. So I'm coming to the end. I'm aware of time. How do we improve our narrative story in public health? The counter story has been driven by ideology, not evidence. And I constantly use the example of the undeserving poor. We're back to talking about the undeserving poor, although it's often dressed up using slightly different words or terminology. I think the NHS may well get some more resources in the next year, but public health and local authorities are in danger of losing again. Government have a very clever strategy of publicly awarding money to big groups like the NHS, probably not enough money, while making local authorities more accountable for their own budgets and asking them to make cost efficiency savings. And I think that's what's going to happen. I really don't see much change in that. And again, we wrote about that of the BMJ back in 2016, I think. So nothing much has changed there. We saw, you know, the Health Foundation, this report last week about from Directors of Public Health asking for protection of public health and public health budgets. And the Health Foundation, who've been tracking reductions in public health spending, this was in this report on the BBC website, said initiatives around stopping smoking, adult drug and alcohol addiction and sexual health services have been the hardest hit. I would include food in that. Food prevention initiatives have been absolutely decimated. A public health nutrition workforce decimated. Grants to local community for return food have also been decimated. And they were big in the early 2000s. Where do we, is the a fence at the top or an ambulance at the bottom? The problem with the ambulance at the bottom is it's more visible to politicians and governments. So the last slide is just some questions. The coming winter, heat or eat. What can we do to help? How can public health really tackle this issue? If I had the answers, I'd give you them. I don't have the answers. I'm hoping that you as a group there will think about this. The hospitality sector is in danger. Predictions are that 1 in 5 restaurants will close. Can we combine food service with hot spaces provided by local authorities? Second World War, kitchens, in Brazil, they've got community kitchens. Can we link hospitality and community in more meaningful ways? And how do we protect public health work and budgets? And again, my point about this is not just a matter of evidence. It's also about how we portray our story in the media and how we counteract some of the initiatives or some of the messages from government. Okay, so that's it from me. I'm going to end there and have a great morning. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there virtually live with you.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, obviously, Martin, it's a presentation really very, very powerful. And obviously, in terms of we are running a few minutes behind this morning, but a very warm welcome really to Dr. Sathi Karunaratne and obviously to Professor Matt Ashton. Would you like to come on screen, Matt, as well? We are going to move into the panel discussion really. So this session, colleagues, is all about COVID and the learning and the experience, the lived experience. Some would say a harsh experience in terms of the COVID pandemic, which isn't quite over yet. But we do have, some very experienced colleagues with us this morning, and really, Matt and Sathi, really, would you like to introduce yourself, really? So Matt first, and then Sathi.
Yes, thanks, Abdul. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Ashton. I'm the Director of Public Health for Liverpool, and I'm also the Lead Director of Public Health for Food Active.
Thanks, Matt. Sathi, please.
Good morning, all. I'm Sakthi Karunaratne. I'm the Director of Public Health in Lancashire, working alongside Abdul and indeed Matt in the region. Hello.
Hello and welcome to you both, really, and thank you for joining us this morning out of a very, very busy schedule. So thank you very much for your time. It's immensely kind of welcome and thank you. So we're going to get into really a generic kind of conversation. Really, there are two major themes to this. The first one, really, if I may, really, if I open this up, really, is the first part really is about what did we learn in terms of your role really as directors of public health in terms of children's health, in terms of actually protecting that, really. So so basically over to you, really. So what did we learn in relation to children's kind of protecting the children's health during the pandemic period, especially during the acute phase? Matt and then Sathi.
Thanks, Abdul. I guess, first of all, just to say thank you to Catherine, Oliver and Martin for 3 fantastic presentations. Really helped crystallise my thinking on this really important issue. A few reflections on the pandemic. The impact of the pandemic has been significant. It's been significant on every single one of us here and, of course, around the world. In England, we saw 170,000 deaths. 1,800 of those were in Liverpool. We've seen 895,000 hospitalisations as a result of COVID. And then, in a wider sense, we've seen disruption to lives, to employment, to schooling and education, to our social lives, and to access to services. So the impact of the pandemic has been significant. But if we think specifically about children and young people, a greater proportion of our children and young people's lives has been during the pandemic. Their experience in their lives are probably more greatly shaped by the last couple of years than we have. I think probably in a general sense, children and young people haven't had an opportunity to build up as much resilience as perhaps adults have to these kinds of system shocks. Unfortunately, we've not seen a pandemic, but we've seen lots of system shocks over our lifetimes, and children and young people haven't had that kind of exposure, fortunately, in one sense, but perhaps less resilience as a result of that. And of course, the pandemic's covered their formative years as well, hasn't it? So, you know, a really, really crucial part of children and young people's lives, formative years, shaping their future and what that looks like, thinking about 1001 Days, early years, and really creating the building blocks for the future. So the pandemic inevitably has had a big impact on our young people. Then thinking about the question, Abdul, lessons learned, and I kind of worry and wonder about whether it's actually lessons learned or perhaps highlighting things that we should have and indeed did know before. So inequalities and the importance of addressing vulnerability. Now, the public health community very acutely aware of this, but in the wider sense, we've heard inequality. We've heard inequality being talked about like never before, which can only be a good thing as long as we then go on to do something about it. I think thinking about that vulnerability element, the importance of families and communities in supporting vulnerable people, really highlighted, and you know, where we've seen great success in the pandemic is communities coming together to look after people. Family security, incredibly important, especially if you're thinking about some of those impacts that I mentioned before, so changing in working patterns, homeschooling, or impact on employment, and then also, of course, family stresses as a result of some of those things, family breakdowns as a result of those things, and then in a wider sense, access to some of the basics, to food, to housing, to education, and to social networks. I think certainly thinking about my experience during the pandemic and my children and the impact on their schooling, the impact on their friendships, you know, you can see the impact that stuff has had, and you try and mitigate it, but you're only able to do so much. I think there's something about adversity really helping. How do we help people to respond to and be resilient to those adversity challenges? And some of the things that I think Martin mentioned, 45,000 people financially excluded in Liverpool, particularly speaks to the scale, the size of that challenge that we've got. So the importance of low-income families, people with not very much money, having a safety net, a state safety net that provides adequate financial support that they can actually rely on and that allows them to live their lives. So choices like heat or eat don't exist. You know, really strong state safety nets. And I think probably just finishing, Abdul, with my quick reflections, austerity, inflation, cost of living is only going to make those impacts worse, particularly on our children and young people. And that's why it is so important that we as a system, as a society, support our children and young people to respond to those challenges. Thank you, Abdul.
Thank you, Matt, really, for some very powerful points there. Sakti, please.
Thanks, Abdul. It's always a disadvantage, I think, if you go next after Matt or anybody as a second, because all the points are taken. So you have to think on your feet, which is what I've been doing. Again, thank you for putting this conference up. It's timely, and I really enjoy working with colleagues in this space. Without duplicating, repeating what Matt said, I want to highlight three things. The first one, what was really noticeable, is the voice of young people was often not heard than heard during the crisis and during the dark days. On the other hand, there was a lot of mobilization amongst the community and indeed some of the institutions of the state, if we want to call it, to mobilize ourselves with resources to support the most needy, like continuing schooling with kits and IT kits and that sort of thing. So that's the first point I want to make in terms of what I noticed, in addition to what Matt just said. We didn't hear the voice of our children and young people and families, especially those that needed the most help initially, at least. But when we realized that, we did stand up. Certainly the professionals stood up. The second thing to highlight is there is a great level of energy and passion amongst people who work with our children and families, and particularly the education sector colleagues, it was such an important thing that we often, again, maybe silo ourselves, even though we think about systems and we think about networks and working across sectors and boundaries. There's a great level of energy and passion for getting the best for our future in that workforce, and we didn't really consider them on par with other frontline workforce. So I think there is something there about, especially when we ask them to go indoors, and, with poor ventilation and that sort of thing. I think that's something that I learned. The third thing is slightly broader, which is we couldn't but underestimate the long-term indirect consequences that were left behind at that time, and now we are finding more and more of that. I'm not quite sure how we may have addressed that still, but thinking about people who were born on the 1st of January 2020, for instance, most of their life has been spent during the pandemic, as Matt highlighted, and the impact this new way of society operating has been not very well understood, and therefore not very well acted upon. Some of the specifics, like access to screen and attention, I really worry about this culture of the screen culture, and the impact it might lead us. Not just the direct health impacts of or the light and so on, but the environment that our society, certainly the future society, have got into in terms of online, being a consumer of the market and advertising, very relevant for this conversation. So that's something that we need to really pick up. And the final one is I look back though in those dark days and looking at my own family. I've got 2 young children. What a great source of motivation they were, and that really got me up in the morning, 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock every day, and it gave me the extra purpose that that's why I'm doing this for, because I want a better future. So I'll leave it there, a mixture of both positives and negatives there for you. Thank you.
Thank you both, really. So in terms of the cost of living, so Matt's talked already about multiple shocks. That's where we are. Clearly, we've got a very unstable period, and we wait, to hear really around the autumn statement on the 17th. Matt's talked very much about what the state can actually do versus, what we can do within our resources. Martin talked about that as well, in terms of some of our resources and the depletion of those. But so I think in terms of strengthening collaboration, alliances, advocacy, trauma-informed practice, really exactly how do we embed that really in terms of mitigations and actions. Any thoughts really on some of these kind of points, really, because we are going to, that could be, if I'm being very diplomatic, really further choppy waters, really. But in effect, really, these are, the economic climate really may result in population level impacts which are not clearly desirable, and clearly may actually then have, as Chris Whitty has actually said, with the National Health Survey published by the ONS, clearly a lot of those key markers within the England kind of health survey have actually deteriorated and actually gone backwards. So therefore, how do we mobilise and remobilise ourselves, for the challenge ahead? So Matt and Sakti, please.
Thanks, Abdul. I'm sorry, Sakti, because I know we're quite close on this subject, so we probably will say similar stuff. The good news, of course, is that we also followed Catherine, who made, I think, some excellent points about how do we start to address not just childhood obesity, but how we actually try to build healthy futures for everybody. I've got about 5 or 6 points to make, I think, Abdul, but I think my starting point is, I think this stuff's fairly obvious. And so perhaps it isn't just about what we need to do, but how we best do it. So what are the tactics that are required to make this stuff stick? But firstly, system response, not silo response. We've definitely seen through pandemic the value of the system response. I think as public health practitioners, we always know that, but sometimes it's harder to work with partners when you have competing priorities, competing agendas, and always, you know, different resource limitations. But it is clear to me that if we are going to keep our communities, our residents, and particularly our children and young people safe over the next 6 months, over what's going to be very, very difficult, then we need a system response, not a silo response. I think Catherine said this very eloquently. We need to build on what works. The evidence base is there. It's not difficult, some of this stuff. And actually, you know, whether that be about food insecurity or actually about poverty, putting more money in people's pockets to allow them to make choices, to allow them to live their lives, we need to use the evidence base. And there's something there about how do we take the politics out of this evidence-based decision-making, or at least how do we mitigate for the political element of evidence-based decision-making? I think we absolutely need to empower our local communities, or should I say continue to empower our local communities, because largely we have fantastic communities, wonderful community groups, wonderful third sector organizations doing brilliant work in the heart of our communities. The context is challenging, the resource is challenging, and the need is challenging, but the approach is the right one. So bottom up, not a top down approach. We need to prioritize children's health for the reasons I said before, you know, the importance of 1001 days and building the foundation blocks for the future. We need to allow people to have aspiration and ambition for the future. And I think that probably takes me on to Marmot. You know, Marmot says it all. What do we need to do? Martin highlighted before, when a society is flourishing, health tends to flourish. And Marmot very clearly outlined 8 priorities, 8 principles now, starting with giving every child the best start in life, but obviously moving on to a range of things, including the fair employment one, healthy standard of living, healthy and sustainable places and communities, strengthening the role of ill health prevention, tackling racism, and pursuing environmental sustainability. And I think the last one I'd like to say, just to highlight, is let's not just focus on physical health. Let's make sure we remember the importance of mental health, well-being, and resilience. And I think, as Oliver highlighted before, the short-term shocks around physical health for very young kids might be being leveled off. That's fantastic if that remains the case. But I worry about the resilience and the mental health impact on all of our kids and whether that stuff will ever level off. Thanks, Abdul.
Thank you. Some great points there, Matt. Really, Satpi, please.
I'll take a different perspective again then. Slightly, what does it mean for us as working professionals in this? So 3 or 4 things. The first one in this is we need to say it as we see it. We need to say it clearly. We need to be brave and courageous in saying it, but we also need to have that compassion and in basically standing up for what we're doing locally and what we want other parts of the society to do. The second thing I say is we need to always be willing to shift our perspective, because we are not it, as in the wider society. We may have the evidence, but other people equally will have the evidence. And the role of science in the society is a longer debate to be had another time. But we as working professionals need to be willing to shift our perspective. And by that, I mean, if we were wearing masks and gloves as PPE during COVID, there is another PPE that I want to highlight, which is the real PPE, which is the politics, the philosophy, and the economics. We need to be more politically astute. We need to be more philosophically and ideologically aware. And we need to be economically more active than mere consumers or customers of what's in the market. And the final one is we should never lose our core values in this. And if one of that is always finding the hope and not despair, we really need to think and reflect and act on the language that we're using. And it may be different for different forums. And we need to be mindful to not create more despair in the residents and communities that we're here to serve, and at the same time be strong advocates for the forums that we really need the change to happen. And as a practical example, one of the things I'm doing amongst all this, yes, like other places, we all have schemes and grants and all sorts of things, warm and welcoming and so on. But one of the things that really nuanced, and it's just highlighted to me, is the way that we need to tap into some of the weak bridges. And one example of that is Lancashire's catering service, for instance. Such a brilliant example of how 100% of suppliers are local, 75% of the food is locally sourced. That kind of creates a sense of place, and also it affects a lot of other things like the environment and air quality and climate change and so on. So that's one thing as an example I'm doing. Thank you again, Abdul, for the chance to be part of this.
Thank you so much, Satvi. So in summary, really, for our delegates, I would say really that clearly it's really about hope, not despair. It's very much about maximising incomes, using the evidence base, making sure really that we're. My apologies, there's a fire test in the back. Okay, I think that may have actually finished, but and I think clearly I'd like to actually thank really both Professor Matt Ashton and also who's had to dip out, and obviously Dr. Satvi in relation to the panel discussion. So thank you so much, and catch up very soon. We're now hitting the actual break this morning, and I'm now at this point really actually going to hand over to my fellow co-chair for the conference really, which is Matthew Philpott really. So Matthew, over to you, and it's been a delight and a pleasure really to actually guide you into the first half of this amazing conference really, and I wish you basically all the best really for the remaining morning as well. So thank you, and I'll dip out at this stage. Thank you so much.
Huge thanks, Abdul. Just to let delegates know that we'll start again really promptly at 11:05. So we're going to have our next presentation at 11:05. But a quick break, make a brew, and have a move around, and we'll see you sharp at 11:05. Thank you. Okay, everyone, we're going to make a start again. It's 11:05. And just a quick thanks to everyone for rejoining us, and also the great speakers in that first session and that powerful panel discussion just to finish with. And a huge thanks to Abdul for chairing that first session, and for the other two directors of public health for their time. So this next session is going to have 3 presentations that are going to be focusing on the cost of living crisis. I know we've touched upon this already earlier today, but we're going to really drill down into this and just discuss its significant implications, not only for child healthy weight, but for wider health and well-being outcomes across society. And I'm absolutely delighted that we're going to have Anna Taylor, who is the Executive Director of the Food Foundation, kick off with our first presentation. Many of you will probably know Anna. So Anna, it's over to you now with a presentation on the cost of living crisis and implications on child health.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and fantastic to be here. Is that all?
That's
working?
Good. That's great.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the invitation to be here, and very good to be with you all in this important session. As the title suggests, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact that the cost of living is having on food insecurity and access to healthy diets, and then end with something quite concrete that I think we could all do right now that will hopefully make a difference. So just to start off with the context, which you'll be probably very familiar with, I'm just going to remove, I think maybe you can see a bar of things up there. I'm going to try and remove that. Okay. We at the Food Foundation track a basic basket of goods on a weekly basis. This is a Tesco basket, and this basket of goods meets the broad nutritional criteria set out in the Eat Well guide. And we're tracking this largely because the CPI data, which is gathered by the ONS and which is reported monthly by the government, is of course incredibly useful for the overall picture on inflation, but doesn't really provide a kind of an actual basket that you can imagine the effects on different households. And so we track our own basket here to try and address that gap. What we're seeing also is, in fact, a faster increase in prices amongst this basket than we see in the CPI data even. And the CPI situation, as you'll have seen in the news this week, is very serious. So this basket of goods has gone up more than 15% since the beginning of April when we started the tracking. And you can see here a picture of the basket, the items that are in the basket, and the prices that have gone up for the woman's basket and the man's basket. They're slightly different because of overall energy requirements being different. This, of course, is coupled with the rapidly rising cost of fuel and energy. So, and often, of course, the energy prices are to some extent, obviously you can cut back on your energy use, but you need to pay your energy bill or you're going to get into trouble. Food is often therefore the bit of the budget which people feel that they can raid, stop buying food or cut back significantly on what they're buying or trade down in terms of the quality of what they're buying. And so it's often the part of their budget which it can be more readily squeezed than other parts of a family's budget. You can see all of this data on that link there. It goes up every week, and there's a lot of data on food prices there if you're wanting to dig a little bit more into it. So we've also, as you probably know, have been tracking food insecurity. We've done now 11 rounds of data collection at the national level since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So for more than 2 years now. And what we do, and when we gather that data, is we ask a standard set of questions which are also used by the government and in fact recommended by the UN and used by lots of countries. So they're standardized questions for gathering information about people's experiences of food insecurity. And we gather the data which allows us to draw conclusions about the levels of moderate and severe food insecurity. So this is where people have skipped meals, gone for a whole day without eating, or gone hungry and not eaten because of lack of access or affordability of food. And here we've plotted the trends in our data since the very beginning of the pandemic in terms of levels of moderate and severe food insecurity on the left-hand side for households with children and for households without children. So we now have an extremely serious situation and a very rapid rise in food insecurity since the start of the year, from 12% amongst households with children to now 1 in 4 households with children, where adults are reporting one or more of that type of food insecurity over the past month. That was in the month of September. And you can see also on that graph that while households with households with children, have always been at higher risk of food insecurity, the difference between households with children and without children has now grown quite significantly in this most recent data point. We think this is because our hypothesis is that some of the government's provision that has been put in place to help people with energy bills and so forth have been in the form of flat payments, which are the same whether you're a household of 1 person or a household of 5 people, and so inadvertently disadvantaging those households, those bigger households, and those obviously bigger households tend to also be households with children. And of course, there are a number of other reasons why households with children are at greater risk, due to the greater cost, of course, of childcare and bringing up children, but also because some of the the measures that are built in within the benefit system, which penalise households with more than 2 children, like the 2-child limit and the benefit cap. And on the right-hand side, you can see really that this problem really around food insecurity, very, very high levels of food insecurity amongst households with particularly 3 or more children. You can see food insecurity rising each time more children are added to the household. And so that we've got a situation in the most recent data where 42% of households with 3 or more children experienced food insecurity in the past month. And again, you can get all 10 rounds of the data and see what how this situation has been unfolding on our food insecurity tracker on our website. So, I should just also say this now amounts in terms of overall numbers to 4 million children who are living in households at risk of that are experiencing food insecurity. Not surprisingly, universal credit is a key risk factor. In fact, more than half of households that are in receipt of universal credit experienced food insecurity in the past month, much, much lower than the 15% of households who are not in receipt of universal credit. And on the right-hand side, you can see here the impact that this is having on people's reported purchasing of healthy food. And here we break down both fruits and vegetables. And this question in the survey is asking people whether they're cutting back on purchases of fruits and vegetables. And we break the data down here between the food insecure households and the food secure households, and obviously see very, very striking differences there between so more than half of food, or around half of food insecure households are cutting back on fruits or vegetables in the past month, in comparison to somewhere around 10% of food secure households. So we can obviously expect that this will start to have knock-on impacts in terms of people's diets, and we'll touch on that a little bit now. So what does this really mean for diets? This is a visual which we produced in the development of the National Food Strategy Independent Review. And apologies if it's a little bit blurry on your screen, but what it tracks is all the food, the nutrient profile score of all the food on offer in grocery stores, so in supermarkets, from the Kantar dataset, and it provides the price per calorie of those foods according to their nutrient profile score. So the nutrient profile score is along the bottom, and the red dashed line is the nutrient profile score of 4. So all those foods which are to the right-hand side of the red dashed line are HFSS foods, and all those foods to the left-hand side are non-HFSS, so non-high fat, sugar and salt foods. And you can see quite clearly that the price per calorie significantly higher overall for foods on the left-hand side of the line. And so you can expect that as people start to cut back on their expenditure, that they'll be forced into purchasing cheaper forms of calories, which tend to, not entirely exclusively, obviously there's some foods that are right at the very far end, like lentils and beans, that are relatively cheap per calorie, but overall pushing people into a situation where they're becoming more reliant on cheaper forms of calories, which tend overall to be less healthy. And so we're also seeing differences between inflation rates between healthier and unhealthy foods. So when you look at the inflation rates between 2021 and 2022, so not the most immediate period that we've been experiencing, HFSS foods increased in price at a rate of 2.5%, whereas non-HFSS foods increased at double that rate in terms of their price. And this is a breakdown from the CPI data of the rate of increase of different product groups, which are within the scope of the CPI basket. And you can see there on the far left-hand side, confectionery still ranking as the category which has seen the smallest increases, inflationary increases, and compared to some of those other products like vegetables, meat and fish and so forth, which are at higher levels. So again, we can expect that this will in turn have a knock-on impact on the quality of the food which people are eating. As I said, we've seen quite significant changes in terms of reported behaviour around fruits and vegetable purchasing, and we've seen that not just in our data, there have been actually now multiple data points which have come from asking people about their purchasing behaviour. There's an important question as to whether now we're starting to see that in the data which captures people's expenditure, and there's some emerging data around that. So most recently, Nielsen data was reporting that sales of fresh vegetables fell by more than 6% and fresh meat by 7% in August, whereas sales of snacks and candy rose by 4%. So we're starting to see the evidence of this in actual expenditure data and sales data, but I think it's still emerging and we don't yet have a full picture. What we do know is when we go back to what happened in 2008, when we had the big food price shocks that happened in that period, the Institute of Fiscal Studies has done a very helpful study which shows the impact that that had on purchases. And we saw in particular that vegetables stood out as being the area where people had significantly cut back on their purchases of vegetables, with obvious knock-on effects in terms of people's health. So there are the dietary effects, which I've just touched on, and this is, I think, touched on in the previous panel conversation, a much wider set of health risks which are attached to food insecurity and fuel poverty that go way beyond what people are actually eating. So there's a growing body of evidence, mostly from North America, in fact, but some emerging evidence from the UK as well, showing that food insecurity is linked to a whole range of child health problems, both chronic health problems and acute health problems. In America, there, a very significant increase in visits to emergency departments, depressive symptoms, asthma, skin allergies, a whole range of child health problems that are reported in some of these studies. And importantly, data from Canada, which shows that food insecurity is directly related to the average healthcare costs which different types of households require. So here you can see a very clear gradient between food insecure people and food secure people in terms of the average healthcare costs that they incur. This is a study in Ontario. And we can fully expect that this will be also playing out in the UK and in terms of NHS costs, but we're sadly not in a position to track some of that data in the UK. So I'm going to just make a small suggestion now of what we can do right now. This is a campaign that we're focusing on in the UK at the national level in partnership with a whole range of organisations you can see listed there on the slide. That you probably will have seen in the last 4 weeks quite a lot of media coverage around this campaign, which is around basically extending free school meals to all children who are in households on universal credit, because there's about 800,000 children who are currently in poverty and not eligible for free school meals in England. And we see this as an important stepping stone towards universal free school meals for children. So if you're in a position to and can, there's a hyperlink right there, write to your mp.click/link. You can write immediately and make a case for this yourself. Obviously, if there's 300 or so people on this line and you all did it, that would make a really big difference. The budget decision is next week, and we're really hopeful that we've made a strong enough argument around both the benefits for children of this protective effect, but also the return on investment for government. This is a really wise investment to make right now. Thanks very much, and over to you, Matthew.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Anna. And I just wonder, that's a really important campaign and a link that I think everyone should be able to get through. Perhaps, Beth, if we put that, oh, you've done it already. Let's put it immediately into the chat. So fantastic. Thanks a lot for that, Anna. Some pretty stark data, I thought, that you revealed in that, in particular, some of those trends in August in terms of fruit and veg sales going down and confectionery going up. This is starting to concretize, unfortunately. So anyway, a real call to action in terms of people actually engaging in that campaign and lobbying their own local MPs. Thanks a lot for that, Anna. We're going to move on now to Nika Pajda, who is Senior Policy and Special Projects Manager at Bite Back. And Nika is going to introduce a pre-recorded message from members of the Bite Back Youth Board. We had, I think, both Sakti and also Matt talk earlier on today about the need to hear children's voices. So here we are, courtesy of Bite Back. So let's hear those voices now, unless you want to give a quick introduction, Nika.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I was just going to say a few words for introduction before Beth plays the videos. So for those of you who haven't come across our work yet, Bite Back 2030 was launched 3 years ago in 2019, and we're a youth-led movement working with teenagers across England to create a fairer, healthier food system. So these amazing young people share their lived experiences, they co-create media and content, and influence decision makers in the food system. So just to paint a little bit of a picture of who you will be hearing from in the videos and the wider team, alongside our National Youth Board, who are a group of 15 incredible young people, we have 100 regional youth board members spanning 6 cities across England. We also have 3,000 young people from 250 schools and youth clubs, and they're all engaged through our slightly newer school and community food champions programs. So the movement has really grown in these 3 years, which is incredible. Our core belief is that it should be easy for everyone to eat healthily, no matter where they live. And as everyone here on the call knows today very well, currently that isn't the case. Our food system is rigged against children's health. And we know that while an unhealthy food system impacts all of us, it has a disproportionate effect on people living in areas of deprivation. At Bite Back, we also believe that we can fix this and that everyone is part of the solution. So we engage with a range of stakeholders at the policy level and government, both national and local. We also work with a group of food and drink companies as well. And you will have spotted our logo on Anna's slide there at the end, and we're part of the coalition. And a few of the other campaigns that we've been involved with since our launch have been extending free school meals, funding through the school holidays, that was during the COVID pandemic, also legislating for junk food restrictions on TV and online advertising, and introducing new measures to monitor the school food standards. So this has been very much a collaborative effort with many of you here today, and thanks very much to everyone's ongoing support as well. So Beth kindly invited me here today to share some of that youth perspective, and I know everyone would much rather hear directly from the young people themselves, but that can be a bit tricky on a school day. So I have the next best thing, which are a couple of clips And these are from panels that we filmed last month with some of our youth board members. They were facilitated by Praise, who was on our London youth board last year and is now an alumna. And it's very much their perspective of the cost of living crisis. They also underline something that the youth board feel really strongly about, and that's that as a young person, it can be really difficult to be heard, let alone listened to in a really sort of adult focused spaces. And we also have a full campaign film, which you can see on our website. So over to you, Beth, to play the clips. Thanks very much.
I don't feel like kids like 11, 12-year-olds should have to worry about what they can afford and what they can't, especially with their parents' money and the parents' bills. They shouldn't have to stress about their parents affording things. They should just be able to get food without going, have I got enough for it? Like adding up, okay, I'll spend this much this day, this much the next day. Like, they're kids, they're 11 and 12, they shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah, I feel like that's just a really big burden on the child to have, like, due to the cost of living crisis, the fact that some families aren't able to have free school meals. I feel like it's starting to, like, in a way scare the child, because that's not a burden they should face at that age.
Yeah, because all children, they should be entitled to be able to get healthy, nutritious food without having to think about the cost it has on their family, or, yeah, generally.
It's not them being oblivious, it's purposeful ignorance, you know, at that point, when you're seeing that there's a cost of living crisis and that so many people are struggling and that there's already been campaigns, you know, in the last few years for free school meals. You're not unaware as a government, you know your country, you're not unaware that kids need food, but clearly as it's not happening, maybe it's just purposeful ignorance at that point, that they don't really care about feeding us.
And that's how we feel. Like, we all, I think we're not the only people that feel like that. You know, we feel like we're being ignored, we feel like we're not being cared for. And, you know, maybe, you know, there might be one or two, three MPs that think, oh yeah, no, I care for these kids. But at the end of the day, like, it's actions speak louder than words, and we're not getting the action that we need.
And it's an annoying thing as well, because the government will be creating different things like white papers. I think earlier this year they created some next paper where they were identifying areas in the UK that are the most deprived and maybe attainment education is the lowest, and they're all thinking of strategies on how to improve this. But why don't you start on a basic level by feeding the children? Like, if you give children that need it food, make sure they have a guaranteed food at lunchtime, maybe you'd actually start to see a difference.
I don't feel like kids like...
Fantastic. Thanks so much to Nika for the
11,
introduction to that
12-year-olds
video.
should have to worry.
And also to the voices from the Bite Back Youth Board for presenting their thoughts today. Just feed the children. That was something that just came across, I think, most powerfully at the end. Stop messing about in terms of policy and white papers. Just feed the children. We're going to move on, because we are a bit short on time, and we're going to move on to a local level presentation. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Naomi Maynard, who is the Good Food Plan Director for Feeding Liverpool. And Naomi's going to give a talk on good food for all. And this is going to be very much from that Liverpool City region perspective. So over to yourself, Naomi.
Thanks everyone for having me, and I'm delighted to say that we support the Bite Back Youth Council in Liverpool, and just really enjoying working with those young people. I think if you can share anything from today's conference, share that video. So I lead Feeding Liverpool with the City of Liverpool's Food Alliance. Many of you will have food alliances in your own regions. Part of our role is, let's just check I can get these slides to move. There we go. Part of our role is driving forward Liverpool's Good Food Plan. This is a plan that launched last year and was developed in collaboration with our City Council, the brilliant public health team. We've already heard from Matt, who kind of heads up this, the universities in the city, Food Active, and many in the voluntary sector. And we spent kind of 2021 really trying to understand what's been going on around food insecurity in our city. We listened to a lot of residents and we brought some of the data together, some of which you can see on the screen about what it's like in Liverpool at the moment. We identified that improving access to good food is key to achieving our aim of everybody being able to eat good food in this city. We need food to be both affordable but also available in parts of the city. We know that isn't always the case in Liverpool city region. So where in Liverpool itself is home to 3 of the top 10 most economically deprived food deserts in England, and 4 of the 10 are in our city region level. So that means some families have got a really long walk to an affordable supermarket. And then potentially, if you think of a mum with a buggy, maybe a toddler in tow, they're probably going to need a taxi home if the bus route doesn't quite work. So that's adding more money onto, their already rising weekly shop. I often have people say to me, why don't people who live in these food deserts just shop online? I live in Everton, one of these top 3 kind of food deserts, and for many of the people in the community I live in, shopping online is just not possible. There's often a minimum spend. At times it's £25, but it can go up to kind of £40 to be able to get delivery to your area. Lots of households just don't ever spend all that money at once on a food shop. The concept of a weekly food shop isn't something that all households do. Many are shopping kind of day by day at their local convenience store. Obviously, data access obviously means that online shopping isn't for everyone. So this means people are shopping at kind of the local convenience store, which will have often healthy food that has a longer shelf life because it might be packaged. It's got to, they'll have less choice available there, and food is of course higher in those stores. We're also a city that's been hit hard by the pandemic. You heard from Matt earlier, and now obviously the cost of living crisis. We're hearing on the ground what Anna said in the statistics about families switching up fresh fruit and vegetables for tinned alternatives or cutting them out completely. Hearing of families reducing the quality and the quantity of food they're eating, often parents skipping meals so children can eat. And when faced with that kind of dilemma between quality or quantity, you are going to pick a higher calorie product that's going to fill your child up and yourself up, which, as we've heard throughout the course of today, has serious kind of long-term health benefits. So I've been asked to focus a little bit about what we've been doing in 2022. These are some of the things we've been doing locally in Liverpool, but other areas, lots of this can be replicated, and we're enjoying being parts of larger networks like Sustain and Feeding Britain and learning from what's going on in other parts of the city. The Healthy Start scheme is something we've focused on this year. We know in Liverpool, as across most of the country, about 1 in 3 pregnant women and families with children under 4 who are low-income households who are eligible for this scheme are missing out on the Healthy Start scheme. And for those of you who don't know, the Healthy Start scheme enables families to get £4.25, and in the first year of a child's life, £8.50, that gets ring-fenced on a little kind of card that looks like a debit card to be spent on lentils, milk and fresh fruit and vegetables, tinned fruit and vegetables and frozen fruit and vegetables. So it's a really important way of ring-fencing a bit of budgets and increasing the amount of money people have to spend on healthy food. It's something I benefited from personally when I had my first child when I was a student, and it makes a significant difference. So in Liverpool, we focused on training. I should have updated the slide. We've now trained 117 community Healthy Start champions. This has involved working with food bank volunteers, pantry volunteers, children's centre staff, housing officers, NHS staff to introduce them to what is the Healthy Start scheme and what role can they play in making families aware of this scheme and supporting people to sign up. It's been quite a simple training kind of programme. We have 20 minutes of explaining what's been going on and lots of time for questions and answers. And then you can see the pictures of some of the Healthy Start champions who are now committed to supporting the people they come into contact with to be aware of this scheme and sign up. Also, 80% of our community food spaces can now accept Healthy Start cards. anywhere with a card machine really can. That's been an important step for people. And public health have supported us with pop-up banners at these community food spaces. It's just another place to remind people about Healthy Start. You get told when you're pregnant, maybe by your midwife, but you're often overwhelmed with information at that point. So if we can tell people at lots of different points, we can hopefully catch some more of those families who are missing out on this important intervention. We've used things like the HAF scheme, which is the Holidays, Activities and Food programme, to get some of the messaging out there, knowing that that's already targeting some families who might have younger children who would be eligible. The other thing we've done is we've done a piece of research, which I'll share the link in the chat afterwards, a Healthy Start for Liverpool. We worked with parents, children's centres, GPs, midwives, public health colleagues on this, and came up with a series of recommendations that could be enacted at our local level, and also national recommendations about how the scheme can be improved. We've been working with MPs such as Kate Green in Manchester and our own local MP, Ian Byrne, to champion some of the national changes that are needed to the scheme in Parliament. So there was a bill put forward, I think it was last week, about expanding the eligibility of the scheme and moving towards automatic registration for it to stop those families missing out. I'd encourage you all to support this when you see information about this bill coming up. That it's a really important and kind of easy win that the government can do to ensure there's at least a maximum uptake of the scheme, but ideally expanding it to include more households. Some of the other things we've been doing locally, as part of the Good Food Plan, we did a lot of work on where are our food deserts, where are the pockets of extreme food insecurity in the city, and in partnership with Feedback and Feeding Liverpool ourselves, we've developed this bus called the Queen of Greens. It's a kind of lower cost fruit and veg mobile bus that with health partners, we've arranged it to stop at 29 health centres and community centres across Liverpool and Knowsley. Your Healthy Start vouchers can be used there, as well as in the city we have Alexandra Rose vouchers and of course cash and card. It's just a way of improving access to fresh fruit and veg for people. When the option is shopping at the fruit and veg bus or going to your convenience store, we're trying to encourage them to come along to the bus. One of the other things we've been doing in the city recently is collectively training up community leaders to be able to run slow cooker courses. We found this has worked quite well at scale. So we've recently trained 20 new community leaders and received kind of enough pooled funding pots together to be able to give them starter packs to run slow cooker courses in their communities and give out slow cookers to families. We know this is have lower energy costs for families and also does promote cooking healthy food together, as well as all the numerous benefits of when people do courses like this, coming together. It's good for your mental health as well as your physical health. The HAF scheme, so the Holiday Activity and Food scheme, are committing to training through us another 20 of their HAF providers in this. It's a great example of how food alliances and HAF programs can work well together to kind of achieve all our objectives of people eating good food all year round. The other thing we have locally as a city is we have a growing community food space sector. We've got community food space map on our website that just shows people where's the nearest one to you. So that's your pantries, your community markets, your local growing areas. These things are really easy to replicate in other areas, but they've brought our network together. They've made us more efficient in being collaborative. You can kind of share best practice ideas, you can pool funding together, and you can do more at scale. The slides will be circulated afterwards, so I put a couple of the links that I'm sure I can also share in the chat as well. Like so many of the speakers, I want to reiterate that these local interventions are great and do make a difference in local communities, but we need national interventions right now. In speaking to our children's centres as part of that Healthy Start piece of research and other professionals, some of the children we're most concerned about at the moment is that group who are just above free school meal eligibility or just above Healthy Start eligibility. So as Anna highlighted, We'd really encourage you all to join the Feed the Future campaign as a first step to at least expanding eligibility to those 800,000 children who are in poverty but unable to get a free school meal, and ideally move towards universal free school meals. We know from the recent Joseph Rowntree research about minimum income standards, it's a really useful piece of research that came out in September, that even with the cost of living support payments, a couple with 2 children on out of work benefits only have just over half, so 52% of what they need for a minimum standard of living. That is frankly unacceptable, and together as a group of kind of 300 or so of us, we need to keep pressing our local politicians and our national politicians that this needs to change. We need interventions that put more money back in people's pockets. So real living wage, subsidised transport costs, reinstating the £20 uplift. I think as charities, many charities on this call, let's not go cold on that kind of campaign drive, because actually having that £20 a week back in people's pockets, we know made a massive difference to children, many of those who are just kind of above that breadline. So that's something I think we can be pushing to reinstate. Similarly, the cost of the Healthy Start vouchers, the real terms cost hasn't gone up in line with what we're seeing as soaring costs of inflation, or the payments given to people with no recourse to public funds. So these are a couple of payments that we need to push to be increased immediately, not in 6 months' time, to really help families through this crisis this winter. Just want to finish by thanking you for having me on today. I've been so encouraged by today's conference, and I feel collectively we can really push towards some of these needed changes.
Thanks so much, Naomi. That was a brilliant presentation. Really, really good to have you on the call today to get that local focus. We do actually have some time for questions, which is great, because I think 3 brilliant presentations there. Naomi, I'm actually going to kick off perhaps with yourself first, actually, off the back of that. I wasn't aware of the Queen of Greens project, which that is just fabulous. I remember hearing you on Radio 4 a couple of months ago in terms of the food deserts piece that Today was running. I mean, this seems a fantastic way of actually starting to intervene on that. Is there any plans to scale that up? And are you actually kind of doing any sort of measurement of that to see what impact that is making in terms of people actually eating healthier diets in this really difficult time?
Yeah, thank you. It's quite a new project. There has been a fruit and veg bus that stopped at much fewer stops kind of in the city, but scaling this up and working with health providers. The bus has been on a soft launch since September because we've had various issues with the actual bus itself. So the plan going forward is for feedback and ourselves to collect some data on its usage and qualitative data with families. So we hope to be able to report on that, but yeah, probably be kind of 6+ months time. We would love to scale these up because we've got a map of the bus routes, and you'll see there's chunks of the city which have high levels of food insecurity that we're not able to visit yet. This is because at the moment it's one bus driver driving one bus. So yeah, a fleet of buses is part of the vision going forward.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. I'm just going to turn to yourself, Anna, and a great call to action in terms of how charities and individuals can start to lobby their own MPs. Is there anything that you'd like to specifically look at in terms of encouraging that greater level of eligibility in terms of Healthy Start? What can we do over and above lobbying our MPs? And what are your kind of core suggestions on that? Because this does seem to be something which is coming through time and again in terms of something that can really start to make a difference in terms of upping that level of eligibility. So over to you on that.
Thanks. I mean, one of the things that we did quite successfully during the pandemic was got a number of the big retailers who accept the vouchers, of course, to add additional value to them. So if people are spending the voucher in their store, getting additional free fruit and vegetables, or a discount on their next purchases or whatever, that worked really, really well. And unfortunately, though, the digital card and the shift to the digital card has now made that really difficult for retailers to actually practically make that work at the till point. There's a number of technical reasons why it's very difficult for them to do so now. That's something we've been working quite hard with DHSC to see if there's a workaround to allow that to happen. That's one thing we've been doing. The other thing, of course, is to expand the eligibility, as Naomi referred to. As with free school meals, there's a large number of people who fall outside of eligibility and are living in very disadvantaged circumstances. That's something else we've been pushing the Department of Health to consider, as well as potentially widening the age band, because we've also got a situation where Healthy Start is eligible for children under the age of 4, and of course not all 4-year-olds are in school and become eligible for free school meals. So there's a bit of a gap there for families with 4-year-olds who are not yet in school, where they're not eligible for either free school meals or Healthy Start, even if they are in that very, very low income, threshold. So those are some of the things that we're pushing for now. But I think all the work, that a huge amount of work, including what Naomi's talked about, going on around trying to make sure that people are aware of their entitlements and are claiming them, is really vital. There's a huge amount of work going on in that space around the country. And so any levers that people think of ways of actually drawing attention to the scheme in the different places where parents are convening and so forth is, I think, hugely valuable.
Fantastic. And just finally, Nika, just in terms of the hotline that you have in terms of young people's voices, we heard some really interesting testimonies and some thoughts from young people in the video. But is there any reoccurring message that you're getting through from children and young people in terms of what action needs to be taken? Not just feed the kids, which is absolutely right, but in terms of kind of specific policy change or interventions, is there anything which is coming through from the voice of young people in terms of actually getting things to change?
Thanks. Absolutely second what Anna's been talking about and the need for extending eligibility. That's been a clear one around free school meals. And then in addition to that, it's just rebalancing the food system so that healthier options are more appealing, affordable, and more available for young people. So that's why they're really passionate about policy areas like the junk food marketing, advertising and promotions restrictions, to just make it easier for young people.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. Well, we're going to have to draw that to a close now. We're slightly over time. So we're going to have another break now, and we're going to start again at 5 minutes to 12. So 11:55 with James Nobles. And we're going to be starting to talk about whole systems approaches to promoting health and child health. So a huge thanks to all of our speakers in that last session. And we'll see you promptly at 5 to 12 for the final session of today's conference. Many thanks. Okay, well, I think we're going to make a start again after that quick break. And many thanks to everyone for rejoining us for this final session. And this session is going to try and offer some concrete responses to a number of the questions raised earlier in the day. And we're going to be looking at examples of whole systems approaches to promoting healthy weight. And the first presentation that we're going to have is from Dr. James Nobles, who is a senior research fellow at Leeds Beckett University. And Food Active have worked with James over the last couple of years in terms of our work around an NHS healthier weight declaration. So James is going to be talking about how are we getting on with these whole systems approaches? So it's over to yourself, James, for this final session.
Thank you very much, Matt. Really lovely to be here as well and have the opportunity to chat about this. So I'll share this. Can someone just give me a thumbs up or a nod, Matt? Can you see that okay?
That's fine.
Perfect. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to try and give us a little bit of an update in terms of how we're getting on with our whole systems approaches. But beyond that, there are, I guess, a couple of main points that if you take nothing more away from this, these are the three things that I hope you can take away. So the first one is that we tend to have a bit of a skewed high quality evidence base when it comes to the prevention of childhood obesity. The second one, and this might be slightly disappointing, but it is very much the reality of this, is that the research on systems approaches is still in the early days. The exciting bit, on the opposite, is that practice is going much, much quicker. And the final point I'm going to talk about within this presentation is that there are about 7 key building blocks that we can start to reflect upon when implementing systems approaches in public health. So if you take nothing more, they're the 3 things that I hope you can take away from this talk today. This is a really nice starting point for looking at the quality of evidence. So for a long time and originating in the medical sciences, the research hierarchy has very much led the way with what constitutes high quality evidence. So at the top of this pyramid, and many of you have probably seen it before, is say the synthesized and filtered evidence. So we've got systematic reviews up at the top, and many of these would be accompanied by something like a meta-analysis. If we look below that, where it's purple and pink, we can see that randomized controlled trials are deemed to be the highest quality of evidence. So randomized controlled trials, they go to great lengths to ensure that the effect can be attributed to the actual intervention. And if we go down this line of thinking, then the best place to look for high quality evidence on the prevention of childhood obesity would be a systematic review of randomized controlled type evidence. And luckily for us, we've got quite a lot of these widely available. So the Cochrane Review publish probably some of the most rigorous systematic reviews that there are. And since 2002, we've had Cochrane reviews available on the topic of interventions for preventing obesity in children. And these reviews also can help demonstrate just how much high quality evidence there is available in the field. So in 2002, 10 studies were included in the review. But in 2018, we had 315 studies that were eligible to be included. So when we need to be making evidence-based or evidence-informed decisions, there's a lot of information and evidence available, and there's also these syntheses available too. But what colleagues and I wanted to do more recently was look at the studies that were included in these reviews and try and compare them against the causes of obesity, and to do so through the lens of the wider determinants of health. Most of you will probably be very familiar with the wider determinants of health, or the rainbow diagram, and it just demonstrates the various levels of a system that have an influence upon our health, from individual lifestyle factors to social community factors, through to the places that we live and work within. A few years ago, we categorized the causes of obesity against the wider determinants of health. And what we found was that about 60% of the causes lie within the living and working conditions, and also the wider conditions, like in those top 2 sort of levels of this, if you like. And then more recently, we evaluated the focus of those high quality evidence from the most recent Cochrane review against the wider determinants of health. And what we found here was actually really quite stark. It demonstrated that we've got a skewed evidence base towards research which is focused on changing individual lifestyle behaviors, often through education-based programs. And where interventions were also seen to target like the living and working conditions, these were typically interventions that were based in schools. So the high quality evidence or the research isn't really accounting for the complex and the systemic nature of obesity. And somewhat in response to this, and in response to many past attempts to prevent obesity, we've seen academics, non-government organisations, governmental organisations, and international agencies all calling for systems approaches. And these are those which better account for like the complexity of a problem and aim to implement a multi-sectoral set of coherent actions. There's been a lot of noise in this field. So approximately 90% of published studies on systems approaches in public health have emerged in the last 10 years. We've seen systems approaches being called for with regards to the prevention of obesity, and in particular childhood obesity. We've seen them being called for in order to improve the population levels of physical activity. And we've also seen them called for addressing serious violence, such as knife crime, and for improving public health more broadly. So what I want to do is spend a little bit of time and look at, well, what does the evidence base now look like that sits behind all of this? As I said, unfortunately at the moment, and I said this at the very beginning, unfortunately at the moment, we're not seeing a lot of good quality research yet in this field. In our review of the evidence, which was published back in sort of 2019, we found about 65 studies which were implementing something that resembled a systems approach in a public health context. And about 33 of those studies were specific to obesity prevention. But only 13 of the 65 studies actually met the criteria for a whole systems approach. And the criteria for a whole systems approach was based on whether or not they met 10 key elements as set out by NICE in 2010. And this is something that I'll come back to in a little bit further into the talk. If we do look at these studies, though, in more depth, only 5 of them reported outcome data. But of those that did report the outcome data, the more elements of a systems approach they included, the more likely they were to see positive outcomes. And those outcomes here include, say, proximal indicators such as health-related behaviours, for example. One of the other key things that we found was that there was very little like sort of systems thinking or systems science that was actually used within these studies. So most of them were multi-level interventions or multi-stakeholder interventions rather than a comprehensive systems approach. So in summary, we're lacking good quality research in this field. And with that being the case, I just wanted to kind of point towards some of the evidence that sits outside of the prevention of obesity. There are 2 other good reviews available in the fields of public health, at least that I've come across. One of these is by Tracy Now and colleagues that reviewed the evidence around physical activity. And the other is by Gemma Carey and her colleagues on public health. Both of these studies included over 100 different studies within them. And the results from both of these reviews actually led to quite similar conclusions. So what they found was that a lot of calls to action being published. There are a lot of studies which say they're, I suppose, underpinning their work with systems science. And then there are lots of studies which are using systems mapping or systems modeling techniques to try and drive what an intervention looks like. So in short, these aren't necessarily about the implementation of a systems approach. They're more about the use of systems orientated methods. So these papers also point towards one of the biggest challenges that I think we're facing in this field at the moment. And some of you might have kind of spotted it already. It's a little bit academic, but it's equally important to point out, and it's around terminology. So I'm just going to give you a few examples on this slide here. So if you were to look at these terms, they might seem very similar, but they point towards lots of different things. So for example, systems thinking might be seen as the way of viewing a problem or thinking about a way of intervening within a system. Cross-sectoral working was probably like pointing towards, say, working with partners from different sectors rather than in a silo. But you don't have to use systems thinking for that. A whole of community approach might say point towards engaging the community members in an intervention, but it doesn't always require systems thinking or cross-sectoral working. So when we brand all of these things as a systems approach, it becomes really difficult to understand what people mean. So cross-sectoral working, for example, might be something that's exceptionally effective, but just as another example, systems thinking might not. So if we keep grouping all of these things together, then we risk making false claims about the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of systems approaches. So the semantics, the terminology, and the definitions, it all matters quite a lot here, but we quite often just use a lot of these terms that I've pointed towards on this slide in sort of a synonymous fashion. So the conclusions that I alluded to on those previous slides have also been drawn by others. So Susan, Jeb, and colleagues, they published an expert consensus around systems-based approaches in 2021. They had 5 main conclusions which corroborate much of what I've already sort of talked about. But the interesting bit for me is what the recommendations for the future were that came out of this expert consensus group. So the first was that they wanted to, or they recommended that we pull together a global community of practice around systems approaches so that we can better learn from each other and develop that sort of consistent language that I was talking about on the slide before. The second point is about the allocation or reallocation of funding so that we can better study and better implement systems approaches within the fields of public health. And then lastly, there's a need to both build and strengthen the evidence base around systems approaches. However, in order to do this, we need to have a better understanding of what a system approach entails in practice. I found at least 9 published examples that point towards like the common principles of a systems approach. And there's a lot of overlap between all of these. So you can see the overlap if you were to look at this in more detail afterwards. You can see the overlap between all of those 9 studies. But they can be boiled down into sort of 7 core principles or building blocks of a systems approach. And what I'd like to do just for the next couple of minutes is give you a feel for what these 7 building blocks are, and then present like a series of statements which stakeholders can use to reflect upon to determine how well these building blocks might be in place locally. So the first at the top is that the approach applies like a complex systems lens to all of its working. So within this, people recognize that they're working within a complex adaptive system, and that this system is going to continuously evolve in response to the efforts at changing it. The approach should also have a strong focus on building relationships between people, communities, organizations, and sectors, and also we aim to increase the collective capacity for people to meaningfully engage in that systems approach. And along that line, effective communication mechanisms are therefore needed to facilitate the flow of information between people, communities, organizations, so that that shared vision, among other things, is held by all about what the approach is trying to achieve and how it tries to achieve that. The focus of the approach should be on collective action rather than siloed action, and we'll hear a lot about that. But this might also need people to think a bit more creatively or outside of the box in order to identify those key levers to change how the system's working. There's a focus on sustainability of the approach and the long-term nature of the approach. And it also accounts for, and this is important, that it accounts for the systemic issues and that it's deeply concerned with things like health equity. Leaders need to be in a position to create an environment that enables their workforce to engage in the systems approach. And this may, among other things, require changes to inter and intra-organizational governance. And then finally, there should be meaningful evaluation in place that enables shared learning to occur between all of the partners who are involved. Without wanting to overwhelm, there are other questions that we could ask to determine how well each of these building blocks are in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send around the slides afterwards, and you'll be able to have a look at some of these statements in your own time. The important thing for each of these statements is that this isn't a definitive list, but even reflecting upon some of these statements can be useful for those who are involved in local systems approaches or the evaluation of local systems approaches. And before I finish this talk, I'd just like to double back to where I started off, which is around the evidence base for the prevention of childhood obesity, the broader evidence base, I should say. So So I was asked to point towards like what works with regards to the prevention of childhood obesity. And luckily for me and you guys, there are lots of good resources available that aren't necessarily systematic reviews that do this exceptionally well. And one of these is a library that's been created by the National Institute for Health and Care Research, or the NIHR. What we have via this library is a summary of the findings from the NIHR related research, and they funded a lot of research in this field. And they've neatly separated all of this out into the different aspects of the system, from the research on, say, interventions that influence purchasing choices, to improving the healthiness of school environments, to the built and natural environments. And all of this is summarized and written with local practice and policy in mind. And rather than trying to answer like the $1 million question of like, does this one particular intervention prevent overweight and obesity? The evidence within this is more focused on, let's say, proximal measures. So for example, does the reorganization of supermarkets impact upon food purchasing choices? And as they highlight correctly in like the top left corner of this, we need action across all of these areas and not just one, in order to be able to make real inroads into the prevention of childhood overweight and obesity. I'd like to finish here just with some final thoughts, and there's a few slides that follow this that I don't have time to go through, but they will be shared afterwards. Is that the first is that system science has a long history, and we really are only still in the early days of trying to figure out its true potential within public health. It's kind of come in quite heavily in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, but if you look at its history, it goes back sort of to the early part of the 20th century. Semantics really matter here, and we need to be able to clearly articulate what we're doing in research and practice. Otherwise, we might risk drawing some false conclusions and potentially either giving up on systems approaches or putting more effort into them than maybe they're justifying. And the last point is that practice is really outpacing research. There's all the funding that's gone into this through, say, Sport England. OHID have put a lot of emphasis on this. Local authorities are doing a lot of work around this, but research really is quite far behind. So we need to better collectively understand what's going on here in order to advance the field. As I say, I'll be able to share these slides afterwards. I've pulled out a few key references and resources. And if anyone wants to contact me, there are my details there too at the bottom of the slide. So thank you all very much. Sharon.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, James. And you're right. I think practice is clearly outpacing research. And in fact, we're going to move on to a presentation which possibly does justice to that statement, because we're going to move on to our local Cancer Alliance. It's John Hayes from the Cheshire and Merseyside Cancer Alliance, who are working with Food Active at the moment on a strategic project around reducing overweight and obesity within the region. It's really interesting that a Cancer Alliance has taken the decision to work on this. So we're going to hear from John now about cancer and excess weight, a whole system approach. So over to yourself, John.
Thank you, Matthew. Can you see my slides? Because you know
yes,
that I'm not very adept at Zoom, but I'll give it a go. So thank you so much for having me here today. And I must admit, I've been here from the start of the conference, and I've loved every single minute. I've been, I guess, equally depressed and enthused in equal measure. I mean, obviously, it's we've got a massive challenge, haven't we? It's depressing in some respects that we have seen public health slipping back. You know, I think as a society we are used to forever making incremental improvements in terms of health and well-being, and we've seen that going in the wrong direction for a decade or more now. So there's obviously a massive amount that we need to do, but the enthusiasm in the room today has been palpable, and yeah, I'm thoroughly enthused. So that's been fantastic. So thank you for having me here. I'm not going to be as academic or learned as some of my previous colleagues. I just wanted to give you a quick update on a piece of work that we at the Cancer Alliance have been doing with the Health Equities group. And I've called it a whole systems approach. I'll probably have to go back to James's slides and just double check that that is a legitimate claim now. But we have we've wanted to really get our feet into this workspace for a little while, and we've probably felt that we've not necessarily had the right skills or knowledge to be able to do that, and hence why we've partnered with the Health Equity Group. So now, if I just quickly move us on to the first slide, just give you a little bit of background in terms of who we are and what we do. So the Cheshire and Merseyside Cancer Alliance is an NHS organisation. You could view us, I guess, as a bit of a partnership or umbrella organisation. We bring different people together. So we bring healthcare providers, healthcare professionals together, those people that design and commission health and care services, patients, communities, members of the public, cancer research institutes, and critically voluntary and charitable sector partners, all with the aim of improving cancer outcomes for our local population. Across Cheshire and Merseyside, but we also work very closely with colleagues in the Isle of Man because they look to Cheshire and Merseyside for a lot of their specialist cancer services. We've got 4 broad responsibilities. I'll just very quickly whiz through those. Firstly, I guess cancer alliances, because there are cancer alliances covering the whole of the NHS in England. We have the responsibility, if you like, to be the local delivery teams for national cancer policy within the NHS. So the NHS long-term plan is a key part of that. And within that, the big ambition is about trying to ensure that the majority of cancers that are detected and treated are diagnosed at a very early stage, which we call stages 1 or 2. Because it's very clear that if we can catch cancer earlier, then it's easier to treat, treatment is better tolerated by patients, and survival rates are significantly improved. We're also absolutely intent on reducing variation, so making sure that we have equality in care, access and experience and outcomes, and I'll unpack that a little bit more in a second. We do have a responsibility of improving performance against the national cancer standards. They're kind of the headline figures that hit the news, hit the press regularly. They're a little bit of a proxy for quality and outcomes, but they're important measures that we have a responsibility to try and improve as well. And we have an eye on the future, so looking at innovation, trying to encourage new ways of thinking, developing best practice, and looking at how we can build and future-proof cancer services, so that we are at the cutting edge, if you like, of best practice for years to come. So just unpacking that second one a little bit more, and so it does include addressing health inequalities, and within that we do have a focus on prevention. So we work with partners across the whole system, including very much our colleagues within public health. Now, we know that more than 21 million people in the UK will be living with obesity within the next 2 decades. We also know that obesity is implicated in the occurrence of many cancers, including common cancers such as breast and bowel. And excess weight is the biggest modifiable risk factor for cancer after smoking. We also know that here in Cheshire and Merseyside, we have a higher incidence of overweight and obesity, including in children and young people, than the national average, and we have higher rates of cancer incidence and mortality. So this is a really important agenda for us. So earlier in the year, we began a collaboration with Matthew and his colleagues, and we wanted to create some more energy, create some noise, I guess, about the links between cancer and excess weight. And so we asked the Health Equalities group to devise and lead a strategic project in this area on our behalf. And we are aware that there are lots of people working in this space, lots of different organisations that are all working on the issues and problems that arise from diet and nutrition. And I guess what we're doing here in this project isn't necessarily revolutionary or necessarily new, but it's all about joining the dots and just adding our voice and adding our weight, if you like, from a cancer perspective into this agenda. So that this project, we've called it a strategic overweight, obesity and cancer project, has several aims which I won't go through in too much detail because they're there on the screen for you, but it is about raising this up on the agenda and making sure that we are engaging as many people as possible, and using our ability as a bringer together of people, if you like, to have very proactive conversations about the links between healthy weight and reducing risk of cancer. So it is about kind of echoing and making that noise, if you like, as loud as possible to really kind of push our weight behind an already busy agenda, if you like. So where have we got to so far? We had a really successful launch event, an online launch event with over 250 delegates back in July. And that included speakers from a range of different stakeholders, including Cancer Research UK. We had the NHS ICB, the Integrated Care Board. We had a panel discussion led by the Health Foundation, and we heard from somebody with lived experience of living with obesity, which brought home the importance of this work to everybody on that event. And at the event, we were able to share two initial pieces of research. One, the first was carried out by Dr. Robin Ireland, who we're going to hear from on a slightly different topic in a moment. And he presented the findings of a series of interviews with key stakeholders. And it was clear from those interviews that there was a great willingness from senior leaders to work together. And those interviews elicited a number of key priorities, which included things like the need to address the wider determinants of health, working at local levels within systems, capitalising on the work of the voluntary sector, learning from good practice, and also supporting people with overweight and obesity. And I think it was important that it was mentioned earlier on today by one of the speakers. I think it might have been Matt Ashton, about we mustn't forget mental health as well as physical health when we're talking in this respect as well. Second piece of research, which we heard about on the day, was from Liverpool John Moores University, where colleagues from their School of Data Science presented data-driven mind maps, which visualized the statistical relationship between obesity, cancer, and deprivation. And then following the launch, the project has embarked on a public consultation, which has been split into two parts, I guess. The first being a public-facing online survey, which takes only about 12 minutes to complete, which explores attitudes and ideas concerning prevention policy, interventions, and the association between excess weight and cancer. And then following the online survey, members of the public have been invited to participate in face-to-face sessions, which are a bit more detailed and help to kind of inform and design campaign messaging that we might be able to use. We've been careful to make sure that participation has been targeted to ensure that we have a wide range of voices across all of our different communities and protected characteristics. So that's all going to hopefully move us towards a campaign which we're starting, we're in the midst of starting now, developing a mini website for the project, hopefully in the early part of next year, we'll develop a targeted work-based weight loss intervention in collaboration with a local employer. So that's kind of a really quick run through of where we've got to today. We at the Cancer Alliance see this as being a long-term project. So we've set out our kind of aims and ambitions for the first part of that that piece of work, but we're anticipating this probably running on for well, multiple years, probably about 5 years or more. So I'd like to thank Matthew and his colleagues in particular for getting us here in such a short space of time, and I think there's loads more that we can and will be doing, and it would be fantastic to maybe come back in a year's time and share even more of the work that we've been doing. So I hope I haven't gone over my time, Matthew. I'll hand it back to you.
You're absolutely spot on in your timing. Thanks very much, John. Really interesting overview from yourself, and really great to be working with our local Cancer Alliance. I don't think there are any other Cancer Alliances across the country who are actually doing a specific piece of work around obesity and its risk factor association in terms of cancer outcomes. So yeah, watch this space, but a lot more to come in terms of that project. I'm going to hand over now to somebody who may not need an introduction for a lot of people on the call today. I'm going to hand over to Robin Ireland, who is the Director of Research for Food Active. And Robin's going to look at a slightly different subject matter, which is around commercial determinants of health. So that's commercial determinants of health, fighting back locally. Robin, over to yourself.
Thanks, and yeah, it's as John was saying, it's a great pleasure to be here, and there've been some excellent presentations. I would say, John, I think the work that the Cancer Alliance is doing is actually very exciting. I think you were saying perhaps it wasn't revolutionary in joining things together. I think it certainly is, because of the leadership of the Cancer Alliance, which Matthew also referred to. I've been asked to talk about commercial determinants of health. And I really, towards the end of the presentation, I want to focus upon what the subtitle here is, fighting back locally. Really, we've been talking about commercial determinants of health at different times across the morning. Next slide, please, if I could have that. We talked, I think Abdul early on talked about Food Active being created in 2013. In 2014, I believe it was our first conference, and at that conference, in discussion with Abdul, we decided to invite Professor Ilona Kickbush, who then and now is a very well-known international figure who's worked with the World Health Organization at all kinds of different levels. And we wanted to ask her over to discuss what we'd started to heard about being referred to as commercial determinants of health. Some of you will be familiar with the term, others may not be so much. And also, just James in his presentation before talked about the rainbow model very briefly, which is a model, as you'll know, done by Darwen and Whitehead to illustrate social determinants of health. There's a debate in terms of exactly how commercial determinants of health fits in with that, but I'd also echo Martin Carragher's expression, what he said earlier in his recording, which he talked about, this is about ideology, and that's to a certain extent what I'll be talking about until we move on to talk about how perhaps we can address them. Now, this is a complicated diagram. You won't necessarily take it all. This is what Professor Kickbush presented to the Food Active Conference in 2014. It actually wasn't published, and 2 years later in the Lancet, and now it appears in quite a lot of places. Now, I'm just going to very broadly talk about it to give you an understanding of what commercial determinants of health are. But the drivers of commercial determinants of health is internationalization of trade and capital, what we often might summarize as globalization, the demand for growth. And this is a interesting discussion now, isn't it? Because a lot of the discussion about the cost of living crisis, about the economy, the emphasis is all on that we need growth. Now, if we have growth, that is really largely led by the outreach of corporations, it says on here. We now have transnational corporations that have bigger expenditure and income than some countries. They're enormous, and I'll be talking about some of them in more detail. The channels that are used to determine commercial determinants of health and marketing, and that's probably what I'm going to be talking about most this morning briefly. Supply chains, to give a very quick example of that, you hear it said sometimes that it's easier to get a Coca-Cola in some countries of the world than it is to get clean water, which is quite frightening. And I remember hearing in COVID where some people were saying, well, we should use the same supply chains as some of these transnational companies because they're damn good at getting product to people, and that's actually the truth. Lobbying, which we'll talk about if we're talking about advertising and marketing of some of the unhealthy commodities we're associated with. These companies will generally lobby against any control over this marketing. And corporate citizenship, which I'm going to go on to describe in a little bit of detail in a second. The outcome of the environment we live in is often determined by commercial factors. We see advertising everywhere. What we're able to buy can be determined by these companies, and we're all consumers, aren't we? So the effect of these determinants of health by the activities of these transnational corporations affects directly population health. Next slide, please. This is a much simpler way of describing the last diagram, and I rather like this because it's definitely not complicated. And I would actually recommend that sometimes you have a look at this report by the previous Chief Medical Officer, Professor Dame Sally Davis. So this report was a sort of almost her last act. And of course, it came out just before COVID, so I'm sure it didn't get anything like the attention it should have. But this is a great definition of commercial determinants of health. Commercial companies use a range of strategies and other approaches to promote products and choices that affect human and environmental health, defined as the commercial determinants of health. And one more diagram, please, on the next slide, which again is a little bit complicated. It actually was produced by an Australian colleague, but I'm now seeing it come up all over the place. This is worth looking at. These are all tactics are used to affect the environment that we all live in, the choices that we have. Sometimes when we're told that we have freedom of choice, obviously our freedom is determined by what's presented in front of us, but it's also largely determined by our income. And I don't think it takes too long to find examples of tactics used by very large companies, usually to promote their product, basically to promote their brands. I'll just perhaps pick one for now. The bottom two, perhaps the undermined science and the manipulation of the media. Well, I'm going to mention COP27 at the moment, which is happening at the time. How long was it before we actually managed to accept that climate change was happening? Because it was questioned all the time by the fossil fuel companies. The manipulation of the media is something I'm going to come to at the end, where we somehow seem to have this idea that two sides of every argument have to be given. Even then, in the example of climate change, 95% of scientists certainly accepted it, very few people didn't. But the opposite view was also provided. That's an industry tactic. The fossil fuel companies wanted us to keep using the fossil fuels. Next slide, please. I mentioned COP27. This is a very powerful image, which has come from, I can't actually remember which NGO did it, but there's a link to the article here. It is somewhat disturbing that Coca-Cola are one of the sponsors of COP27. And this is a tactic that companies use. And I've done a lot of research in sport, and they use sport in exactly the same way to present themselves as all-round good guys. So remarkably, Coca-Cola have been involved with the Olympics since 1928. They've been involved with the Football World Cup since 1974. They do these things, but they want to present themselves as great members of society. They're contributing to the quality of our life. And of course, you only have to go out in the streets or go down any riverbank to find the biggest polluter in terms of litter are fast food companies. And also, I can't remember off the top of my head how much water is used to produce one small can of Coca-Cola, but it's considerable. It's environmentally unsustainably. But yeah, they've got a lot of money. They've got huge amounts of money. So often, unfortunately, it happens at all kinds of levels, and that's what I want to come on to. Sometimes it seems to be the easy solution to take money from companies like these rather than challenge it, and it's often difficult to challenge. Next slide, please. I'm aware, and I think this is quite important, that if we're talking about commercial determinants of health, although I'm going to focus in on the food industry in a minute, of course this applies to the gambling industry, it applies to the alcohol industry, which is this slide is particularly referencing, but of course the people who all perfected this is the tobacco industry, and we have so much to learn from the public health battles, and it really was battles. We knew tobacco was incredibly bad for our health from about 1960, arguably, which date we pick, and yet they were still promoting their products and glamorizing their products until well into the 21st century. And it's of course, the playbook that we all have, and whether we're talking about junk food, whether we're talking about healthy weight, whatever we're talking about, what we always hear, and Martin Caraher very much focused upon this, I think, isn't it all about down to education and better lifestyles? That it's all about the individual, isn't it? So it's our fault for actually believing all this advertising and going out and putting unhealthy food into our bodies or driving too much. It's all our fault. I'm not going to go through this slide in great detail, but I don't think I've got too much time. But you can see how the language you use and sometimes how difficult it is from public health to actually address that. And we heard actually quite strongly from the Bite Back 2030 clip that Nika produced earlier, how young people really can see this advertising targeting them. They want something to be done about it. And sometimes we're kind of given the idea that these kind of interventions aren't popular. That's not necessarily true. We're hearing sometimes what's presented to us from the voice of industry, and I think the bottom bullet point here from the alcohol industry: heavy-handed regulations are slow and costly to introduce. Voluntary commitments are better. We hear that all the time, but of course nothing actually happens then, does it, if we wait for industry to do it? Because bottom line, and if I'm sounding incredibly critical of industry, well, if you run a company and you produce fast food or you produce sugar, of course, your duty to your shareholders is to increase your profit line. I'm not being critical of that. That's the society, that's the environment that we live in. So we expect that to happen. So it's our role, isn't it, as a responsible society, to redress the balance sometimes. Sitting here in public health, and I think it was, I can't remember, was it the Health Foundation, the slide showing how little money is now going into public health. It's incredibly hard to address these commercial interests. So I'm probably sounding quite negative at the moment. Next slide, please. Oh. There you go. It froze for a minute and came. I talked about tobacco control, and there has been a little bit of focus, and of course Food Active's origins, although it works very much nationally now, they do come from the Northwest. And our host charity, which is now the Health Equalities Group, formerly Heart of Mersey, I'm old enough to have been here when we worked around tobacco control extensively to lobby for effective national policy. Well, some of the drivers for that was done locally, and I know Matt Ashton won't be with us now, and he may be far too young to remember all this, but the Smoke Free Liverpool Coalition back in 2004, 2005, and then some of the work done across Northwest England had a huge impact upon the national policy that we came through, despite all the lobbying, all the influencing, all the grubby work done by the tobacco industry. We had an impact, and all of us who were there at the time are proud of that. And there's an awful lot to learn from that kind of advocacy that can be done on the ground. So I want to focus now briefly, and I'm slightly aware of time now, of what we can do, because all this talk about huge transnational corporations can be incredibly disempowering. We'll think, oh my God, how can we possibly tackle mega organizations like Coca-Cola? It's incredibly difficult. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to pretend that signing up to the Healthy Weight Declaration protects a local authority from taking on all these companies and sorting everything out in one go. But we certainly wanted within the Healthy Weight Declaration that we've now got, or about to have anyway, something like 30 councils across England of different size who've actually signed up to this. But within the Healthy Weight Declaration, we specifically wanted to look at commercial determinants of health. There were 16 commitments in the Healthy Weight Declaration. I picked out 3 here, which come under the heading of commercial determinants. I'm going to very briefly whisk through, and I'd love to hear from other councils. And some of the councils I'm mentioning here aren't necessarily ones that signed up to the declaration. Some have, some haven't. But it's a mechanism that can perhaps help them to address some of these commercial determinants. At the end of all this, you'll have my contact details, or please contact Food Active if you want to find out more about any of them. So a quick whistle-stop tour of approaches to address commercial determinants of health at a local level are going to follow. Next slide, please. The first one is from Blackpool, who were actually the first authority to sign the Healthy Weight Declaration way back in 2016. Now, this is a positive example of how to work around commercial determinants of health, which is where they've worked with, I mean, obviously Blackpool is synonymous with tourism, the prom, fish and chips. So it's been working with local fast food retailers to actually see if they can provide healthier options. It's a very, I mean, I don't think all fast food outlets all want to poison us and give us far too much fat and sugar and salt. And sometimes it is about working with them to say, what can we do to help you provide health? We don't want to put you out of business. We just want to make you a little bit healthier. So that's an example of a positive approach to commercial determinants. The next slide, please, is not my slide. In fact, probably the next few slides are borrowed from. I should have credited both Beth Bradshaw and Matt Ashton at the start for giving me some of these slides. But obviously tackling junk food, I say obviously, but I think it is from what's been said before and also within this presentation in terms of the power of marketing, is addressing junk food ads at different levels. That can be from bus shelters, that can be from billboards, that can be from transport. And there's been a lot of work done by the organisations shown at the bottom of this slide and across the UK actually. And as I say, I'd be very interested in more examples. So let's just focus very quickly on 4 different areas that have done work around this. Next slide, please. Bristol, they were the first council to do an advert ban on fast food, alcohol and gambling. You'll see other councils mentioned there. And the next one on the next slide is Barnsley Council, who restricted advertising. That's the next slide, please, Beth. Who've restricted advertising on council-owned sites. And we have to remember the council do own quite a lot of sites. They can influence. And mentioned within this slide as well is the work done for Transport for London, where they've banned unhealthy advertising on their premises. That's had an identifiable impact in terms of both how much through modelling, being able to show how much exposure has gone down to that kind of advertising, the impact it can have on the population there. Incidentally, when you hear companies saying, well, marketing doesn't have any impact, and they genuinely do say that sometimes, you think, you're having a laugh. They wouldn't spend all that money otherwise. So it's not necessarily that hard to model to see if you can take that out, what impact can you have. Next slide, please. There's work that can be done around planning. I think this is really important. Gateshead have done some work around supplementary planning guidance, reduce the proportion of fast food outlets, and a very recent study in the next slide which is from Sunderland. They have signed up to the Healthy Weight Declaration earlier this year. It was part of the things they were able to use to turn down a KFC drive-through in their area, and very importantly. So I'm going to finish with 2 more slides. The next slide is, we can do things locally. I've just given you some examples. I started off, and yes, it's quite a frightening world in terms of the power that transnational corporations can have, but we can do things, and we probably need to, because unfortunately, as Martin Carraher and others pointed out, some of them, and Catherine at the start, we don't know what's happening around the bog off, the advertising on TV, the white paper on tackling health inequalities is completely gone. I think it appears to be, I think it's even more important that we do things at a local level where we can to protect our populations against commercial determinants of health. I believe very strongly it's within the local authority remit. At the same time, we do need to celebrate what's been achieved, and the examples I've just given, we need to share those, we need to learn from them. So if you know of others, please do let us know. On my next slide, I'm really sorry to put this slide up. It's like, you know, it's like the demon that comes at Christmas, the nasty thing that hides around the corner. Of course, everybody loves big red trucks, flashing lights, and of course, it's not always very easy, and it's not necessarily very popular within public health to oppose it. But when you see the terrible oral health we have, when we have the levels of obesity they have, we need to, and we should not be letting this truck, if it appear on our land. And I know that I'm going to be asked very shortly to do a podcast around this subject, so that might be something you'd be interested in. So thank you for your time. I hope that was helpful, and I would certainly like to hear more from you if you've got examples around commercial determinants of health. Back to you, Matthew.
Thanks so much, Robin. Fantastic. And yeah, there really are opportunities at local level to make an impact on this agenda. So we're going to move on very quickly because we're starting to run out of time as we head towards our finish point of 1 o'clock. So I'm going to introduce our final speaker of today. I'm thrilled to introduce Alice Jennings, who is Senior Communications Strategist at the Frameworks Institute. And Alice is going to give a really interesting presentation on what surrounds us, shapes us, and how to talk about child health. So a specific focus on language. So Alice, over to you for our final presentation.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I'm just going to share my screen. Can you confirm that you can all see that okay?
That has not come up yet, no.
Not come up, sorry, 1 second. It says screen sharing is paused. Resume share.
Perhaps take that back off and take it off full screen into the slideshow, put it back up and then go on to slideshow.
Okay, hang on a moment. There's always one person who does this, isn't there? And today it's me. All right, hang on a moment. Da, da, da. Right. How's that?
No, that unfortunately is not coming through. So I'm wondering, Beth, is that something that you would be able to look at? I'm just wondering whether you would be able to use those backup slides at this moment.
Yeah, just give me 1 second. Alice has just sent them to me this afternoon. So
it's saying my screen sharing is paused and I don't know why. When I click resume share, just nothing's happening. Apologies for this, guys.
I think we can resolve this. It's okay.
Right.
So Alice, just in the meantime, perhaps if you could give a very brief intro to the Frameworks Institution, your role within the organisation.
Yeah, hi, of course. So I'm Alice, as Matthew said. I'm a Senior Communications Strategist at Frameworks UK. And my first bit of the talk, you don't need to be able to see the slides for. So I'll just tell you a bit more about Frameworks and what we do. So we're a non-profit communications research organisation, a little bit of a mouthful. And we work with other mission-driven organisations to frame public discourse around social issues. So I think this chimes really nicely with what some people have said in their talks today. Martin Carraher asked, how can we improve our narrative on child obesity? And that's exactly what we've been researching extensively for the past 6 years. And we've got multiple research publications digging into exactly how the British public think about this issue. yeah, we have a whole wealth of recommendations on how you can communicate about the issue, and that's around building support for the solutions that we need. I could talk about them sometimes I do talk about them for a day, but we've only got 10 minutes today, so I'll be talking you through just the 2 most important ones for your purposes. I probably won't go much further into what I'm about to talk about before we've got the slides ready. So just checking on how Beth's getting on there.
Yeah, sorry, Alice. I've got the WeTransfer link, but they're only coming as a Internet Explorer download. So I can't actually download them from your WeTransfer link, I'm afraid.
Sorry about that, everyone.
Don't worry.
We try again me sharing the screen, and we'll see if me putting things on different screens makes that work. Okay, give me 1 second. Hang on. Okay. It's still saying my screen sharing is paused. I have no idea why it's saying that. Have I got like not the right permissions or something?
That's what I'm wondering. Beth, are you sure that the permissions aren't still kind of on your side after Robin's slide? So the permissions need to go back to Alice?
I've just made you co-host, Alice, so try to give it another go now. That might work, but we did try them earlier on this morning, didn't we? So
yeah, they worked fine this morning.
Yeah.
Okay. It's still saying my screen sharing is paused. Look at advanced sharing options. No, hang on. Maybe if I go out of this and go back into the presenting. Getting screen sharing paused. I'm sorry, everyone. I have no idea why this is happening. Possibly I can try and talk you through it without the slides.
Yes, I think that's probably the only option we have, Alice. So perhaps if you could just go through those quickly, and we'll be able to circulate the slides after. So if you just give a verbal presentation, thanks a lot.
Of course. So apologies for this, everyone. I will jump right in without further ado then. So the title of my talk is, which I'll read out for you not being able to see the slides, is What Surrounds Us Shapes Us, How to Talk About Child Health. And like I said, we've got kind of 6 years of research. We've been partnering with Impact on Urban Health to do this since about 2017. And that's around conducting extensive primary research into how we can most effectively communicate about child obesity. And our aim with the research has been to look at how to rebalance public thinking, moving away from that overwhelming focus that we see on individual decision-making and towards seeing systemic and policy-level solutions to rising child obesity. So I'm going to be really top level and as practical as possible today in how I talk about these insights. So I won't go much into research methodology and things like that, but those are all on our website. So we have, I would have on the screen now, the 3 kind of biggest publications that we have on this. They're all available on our website, and they have research appendices and so on that you can go and check out if you'd like. So we've consistently found that the British public have some really deeply embedded unhelpful ways of thinking about this issue. I think some of those won't be news to any of you listening. We've already had some other speakers mention some of these. So the most common way of thinking we found about obesity is that it's an issue of individual poor choices and a moral failure on the part of parents when we're talking about young children, or on the part of the young people themselves when we're talking about teenagers. We found that people don't think about the wider factors that shape children's health, things like the cost of healthy food, the role of industry advertising, or the lack of space for children to run and play. As a result, thinking's dominated by blaming individuals, and there's just not much space for system-focused solutions. Instead, the only solution that this way of thinking leaves room for is education, that we need to educate people to make better choices. Or as Robin just said on the framing of the tobacco industry, that it's all down to education and better lifestyles, isn't it? But the research found that we can do a lot better than this. So there are ways of communicating about children's health which can increase understanding of how what surrounds us shapes us, and that can build public support for change. So again, I have to thank Robin for conveniently previewing what I'm about to talk to you about, because he mentioned framing, and framing is what we need to do here to build better understanding among the public. And framing is about making choices about what ideas we share and how we share them. It's what we emphasize, how we explain an issue, and what we leave unsaid. And framing matters because these choices can lead to radical changes in how people think, feel, and act. And in our case, it can lead to radical changes to the solutions that people will support. So I was going to show you here a video to demonstrate the kind of visual difference that we see in how people think about child obesity when exposed to different framing. I don't think that that's likely to work at the moment as the slides aren't working. So I'm going to skip over this bit, but I will tell you that we can see examples of people. We often carry out on the street interviews as part of our research. So we will ask people a set of questions around how they think about an issue such as child obesity. And then we'll give them a piece of well-framed communications to read. We'll ask them the same questions and we'll often get vastly different responses, things that you just wouldn't expect that the same person could hold these two different mindsets. But it is really, and you can see some of the quotes from this in our reports if you do have time to go and check them out after this, but it is really incredible the difference that the right frame can make in how someone will think about the same issue. So I'm about to go into a very condensed version of what we know works from all of our research to talk to you about child obesity to bring about that kind of shift.
And how about child?
So you might have noticed that my talk doesn't have the word obesity in the title, and there's a reason for that. That's because the first and most impactful thing that we can do is to make clear that this issue is about children's health before we bring in obesity. When we just say the word obesity without framing around health first, people jump straight to that mindset of individual blame that we've looked at here. And once you've triggered an unhelpful mindset, it's really hard to budge someone from it. So leading with children's health before we talk about obesity works great to inoculate against this and to start people off from a much more helpful mindset. So this was one of the main things that we tested in our research. We did a large-scale survey experiment where we tested different ways to frame child obesity. I have a nice graph to show you here in the slides, which unfortunately you're not going to be able to see, which is a shame, because it's a really stark representation of just how differently people can react when you frame things around child health versus around obesity. I might try and send that specific slide around after this with the follow-up email, just so you can see. But basically, one of the survey experiments that we did is that we asked in a large-scale nationally representative survey, we asked people about their support for a fictional piece of legislation to tackle child obesity. And that basically gave us a control group, right? So it showed us how people think about this issue and would answer these questions without being exposed to specific pieces of content on the issue. Then when we asked them the same questions after giving them a piece of communications framed around child obesity, so the questions were about a fictional bill on child obesity and their support for it. When we framed the bill around obesity, the results of the change in their opinions were not statistically significant. So we asked them questions about their support for the bill, their support for policy change, and their belief that society must act. And as I said, when we framed it around obesity, it didn't do very much. It was the same as kind of saying nothing at all. When we asked them about the same questions, a different group, having framed the bill around child health before we brought in obesity, their support for the bill, their support for policy change increased by an easily statistically significant margin, and their belief that society must act, so their sense of collective responsibility, shot up as well. It made a huge difference. A quick caveat here, we can still talk about obesity, but it's about sequencing. We need to prime people first with what this is actually about, improving children's health. Our second recommendation is to explain how what surrounds us shapes us. So I was really pleased to see on Abdul's slides this morning, less victim blaming, more environment framing. And that's exactly what we want to do here. We bring in the role of the environment and we explain how it impacts on children's health. We're already seeing lots of people doing this well, and we've heard from some of them at this conference today. For those who do want to check out my slides later, I've got examples of some kind of social media posts from lots of different organisations, including people like the Food Foundation who are here today. We've got Dame Sally Davies on there, who I'm pleased to see some other people today are a fan of that outgoing report as Chief Medical Officer. But the point is that lots of people are doing this well already, and we're kind of building momentum with this helpful way of environment framing. When people can't see the role of the environment, they often default to the idea that this is just the way things are and that nothing can be done about it. So instead of just describing why obesity is a problem, we must explain how things like where someone lives or industry advertising practices or their family's income can impact the options available to them. We can talk about the role of the built environment and access to green spaces and how all these things impact a child's ability to be active. Note that I said to be active there and not to get some exercise. That's because our research found that when we use the word exercise, it limits people's thinking to pretty formal, organized kinds of exercise, like a gym membership or going for a jog. It was more helpful, our research found, to talk about children having the opportunity to run and play, to use that exact wording. Another thing to flag here, it made a big difference to talk about the options available to people as opposed to the choices available to them. That's because options makes it much easier for people to see context rather than blaming individuals. So, framing is fundamentally about the ideas that you share. There are lots of different ways that you can evoke these ideas without everyone using the exact same wording. The recommendations from our research are designed to be flexible enough that a really broad range of organisations can use them, using their own wording for their own audiences without sounding exactly the same. That said, for those of you who are in a hurry and want some quick things you can incorporate into your messaging for now, just want to kind of press the quick wins from our recommendations for you. So I've got 3 things to leave you with. Firstly, we want to always make clear that this is about improving children's health before we go on and start talking about obesity. Secondly, easy language tweaks here. We use the word options rather than choices to leave no room for people to default to that frame of individual blame. And thirdly, we talk about children having the chance to run and play rather than to get some exercise, to give a much more holistic view of what being active looks like. Thank you for listening. Apologies for what happened with the slides there. Just to say this was by necessity, just a small snippet of the insights from our research. We have lots more on our website, including those 3 research reports that I mentioned at the start. And we also have a link to the toolkit, which is the most accessible version of this, which I can see Beth has already shared in the chat. We have details on the slides as well of how you can get in touch. So when Beth sends those around after, if anyone has any questions or wants to know more, please do feel free to reach out to me because I'd love to talk about this stuff, talk about it all the time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks so much. That was really difficult. So I apologize that we weren't able to get those slides up, but Beth has linked to the toolkit in the chat and we'll be circulating all of the slides, including the videos, etc. So thanks a lot for that thought-provoking and quite different presentation in terms of framing. We're slightly behind time, so we need to wrap up because we should have finished at 1 o'clock. And I need to let delegates know that in conjunction with today's conference, the Food Active team has developed a range of new resources relating to the conference themes. And I just need to flag up that we produced a new briefing paper on the cost of living and healthy weight, which will be distributed, a specific cost of living briefing for local authorities that have already adopted Food Active's healthy weight declaration that Robin mentioned during his presentation. And we're also releasing a new position statement on health disparities and healthy weight. These can actually be accessed now through the link that's being provided on page 18 of your conference program that you should have received, but we will disseminate those to all delegates in follow-up to today's event. I've just got a few thanks to give just to finish off. Obviously, a huge thanks to all of today's speakers for their contributions and for their time to prepare and deliver the presentations, and to you, our delegates, for joining us. We hope that you found the conference useful, and we do appreciate you joining us. On a personal level, I'd really like to thank the Food Active team, in particular, Beth Bradshaw, for developing the conference programme for today and running today's event. As I mentioned, presentations will be circulated immediately after the conference finishes, and also by email next week. We'll also include a very short survey that we'll send, and please do complete that, as it's really helpful in terms of getting some feedback from you. Once again, the Food Active conference will take place next November in 2023. So many thanks for joining us. Apologies for the few IT technicalities at the end. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.